Good afternoon. This meeting of the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission will now come to order. Today is Wednesday, December 7th, and the time is 2:33 p.m. Let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll start with roll call. Vice Chair Freeman.
Here.
Vice Chair Herrera. Commissioner McNulty.
Here.
Commissioner Sturts.
Here.
We have a quorum, and we do expect Commissioner or Vice Chair Herrera to join us soon. Other folks at the table include our legal counsel. Today we have Kristen Wintberg, and Mary O'Grady's in the room, but she'll be leaving early. That's why she's not sitting at the table. We're glad to have Kristen. Joe Canfield. And then our mapping consultant, Willie Desmond and Ken Strasma. Our executive director, Ray Bladine, is in the back of the room, along with Deputy Executive Director Christina Gomez. We have our Chief Technology Officer, Buck Forst, who is ensuring that this is streaming over the internet today. Our court reporter is Marty Herder, taking an accurate transcript of today's proceedings. So if you would, when you come up to the microphone to address us, please be sure to spell your last name so that everyone can, so that we get an accurate transcript of the, for the record. And then we have Stu Robinson, our Public Information Officer, is also in the back. And I think that's everyone that I've got. All right. So our next item on the agenda is number 2, presentation on the draft congressional and legislative maps by members of the Arizona State Legislature. And so I believe we have 2 coming up. So our first will be Senator Andy Biggs, who will present the majority report.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm grateful for that you've given us this time for me to report, and my colleague, Representative Chad Campbell. I also want to comment just briefly on your director, Ray Bladine, and his staff. They've been always cooperative and very helpful, and so I want to tip my hat to them and express my appreciation to them as we go forward. I'd be remiss not to do that. As you know, the Constitution allows the legislature to review and have input with regard to the maps, and it requires the IRC to consider the input of the legislature regarding the maps in the process. And so, in order to fill our responsibility, in October, the legislature formed a joint legislative committee to review the draft maps, and we took public testimony. We had expert witnesses come in as well, and we wanted to get input. And so we then, on October 28th, produced a report, and it's my understanding that it has been distributed to each of you, and I hope that's the case. And then we proceeded to do memorials in the House, and then it's my understanding that the Chad Campbell and the minority and the legislature put out a minority report, and so now I'm going to report on that. And I would just want to clarify, it looks like you allotted 50 minutes, Madam Chair, and so I'm assuming that we're each going to get roughly 25 minutes. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, but if you need to go over, that's fine. We can go longer. It's no problem.
Well, Madam Chair, thank you so much. As Mr. Campbell will no doubt tell you, as a lawyer and a legislator and politician, with a microphone, I'm liable to just go until you drag me out with a cane. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. So let me just commence by saying our conclusion was that we felt that there was some constitutional deficiencies in the maps and how they were put together. In particular, we were concerned initially because there are a set of criterion within the state constitution that the IRC is required to follow, and the first one, of course, is to follow the U.S. Constitution and also the Federal Voting Rights Act. And to that end, we had brought in an expert witness, Dr. Lisa Handley, who is, if not the premier, is one of the top few experts and Voting Rights Act, and she's testified in probably nearly 100 cases. She's done this type of research throughout the world, and we asked her to help us out because one of the things that we felt disadvantaged of as we reviewed the maps is that there had not been any data analysis done with regard to majority-minority districts. And so we asked her to explain to us what would be some of the typical tests that one would engage in as an expert to tell us what to do. And so she provided 3 different tests, and none of those had been completed or done at the time the draft maps were issued. That was a concern to us because since the 30-day period and window following the promulgation and vote on the draft maps, we were left without understanding whether what the analysis was, and so we inquired and we were informed that analysis had not yet been complete, or that I don't want to misstate the letter because I'm not sure if it said not yet complete, but that you didn't have that information yet. And so we felt that the 30-day period, 30-day window, when we were constitutionally permitted to review and then comment on those maps, we were disadvantaged because we couldn't make any meaningful review of the application of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the 3 tests that Dr. Handley mentioned to us were the homogeneous precinct analysis, or the bivariate ecological regression analysis, and the third was the ecological inference analysis. And the test that is the most statistically meaningful is the bivariate ecological regression analysis. Now, it's my understanding that the commission retained Dr. Gary King, who was going to do an analysis. I don't know, and I've heard, though I haven't seen it, that he has completed analysis, and I've not yet seen that analysis and haven't had a chance to review that. I assume he's the same Dr. King that was doing political science work when I was working on graduate degrees at ASU, and I was surprised to see that he was retained because when I was doing some graduate work there, his expertise seemed to be he was a congressional behavioralist, and so I was kind of surprised that he was now doing this type of analysis, although that doesn't mean, because it was so long ago when I was in grad school, that doesn't mean that he couldn't have changed his stripes just a little bit. And I'm not making any aspersions that he's incompetent, but the point I want to make clearly is that when we asked Dr. Handley why you do these types of analysis and when should they be done, obviously you do them because you have to be prepared to deal with the DOJ clearance. And you typically do them before the draft maps are issued. That way the public and, in my case, the legislature would have an opportunity to review those maps in light of the analysis. The second point that we looked at, and this is the second constitutional point, is the requirement of equal population under the Constitution, both federally and for the congressional districts and for the legislative districts. The draft legislative map is at 5.6% overall population deviation, something that we felt was suspect with the requirement that that there be equal population. And so then we move on to the third criterion, which is the geographical compactness and contiguity. And look, I recognize that is extremely difficult to do in a state the size of Arizona, and the population centers being located largely in 2 counties. But nevertheless, LD7, the proposed LD7, is larger than some states. And it has 3.5 times the size of the next largest draft district, and it is twice the size of the largest current legislative district. And it was our perception that LD7 became disproportionately large and rather than compact because of the treatment of Flagstaff. And that was our perception based on what we observed and what we heard in our testimony, and then following the IRC as it proceeded to have its numerous meetings as well. Then we move to the next criterion, which is respect for communities of interest. And just one example that I'll point out to you is the Congressional District 9. It seems to unnecessarily aggregate parts of several disparate communities of interest within Maricopa County. And to be frank with you, as we took our testimony coming in, I would say that was the largest issue that we heard about, was communities of interest. People came from all over the state saying, well, you know, we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be with them. And again, we recognize that is a difficult task to respect communities of interest always. But that certainly was what most of the complaint were that I heard sitting there for on that joint legislative committee. Let me give you another example. This LD7 includes a huge area from the northwest corner of the state to Greenlee County on the south. Greenlee County is hundreds of miles away from the northwest part of the district and has nothing in common with the Navajo Reservation or Coconino County. These types of things are always problematic, even in my district. And let me just tell you, I have no axe to grind with my district in any of the iterations, really, that the commission had. But even in my district, as it currently sits, there are disparate interests between, say, the people out at Peralta Trailhead, east of Apache Junction, and those within the heart of the town of Gilbert. And we hear about that, and since I cover portions of two counties, a portion of Pinal County, for instance, feels in some respects disenfranchised because they're smaller, it's hard to get out to them, and they don't always feel like they're heard. And I understand that, and that's a legislative officer's difficulty as much as it is the drafters of the legislative districts. Number 5 is, where practicable, the use of visible geographic features, city, town, and county boundaries, and undivided census tracts. And all of these, I'm just giving you one or two examples of what we found. And so I'll again do that, but in our report, there's a far more extensive list of these. CDs 1, 4, and 9 seems to violate these criteria by making copious, unnecessary divisions of municipal, county, and census tract lines. The legislative district map in Pima County splits several census tracts itself, affecting the positioning of several incumbent legislators. And I'll get into that portion of the constitutional issue that we had in a moment. Then what seems to have been the overriding factor, at least that we heard about, is the need for competitive districts. Yet, in the Constitution itself, and also in the case that is the standard on this particular, on the IRC and how to format legislative and congressional districts, competitiveness is the last requirement, in the sense that it is a mandatory requirement. That's the word of the Supreme Court. It is a mandatory requirement. But there's nothing in the case that says it is equal or equivalent to the other criterion. It is conditionally equivalent. And the condition is competitiveness cannot substantially denigrate any of the other propositions or the criterion of the Constitution. To do so is a constitutional violation. And so I thought I would just read briefly from the case, Chief Justice McGregor writing, as the Court of Appeals noted in Redistricting 1, that's the previous case prior to this one, the competitiveness goal is both mandatory and conditional. What's interesting about that is the other criterion are not conditional. They are mandatory. That's my own editorial on it. But to continue on the case, if drawing competitive or more competitive districts would not be practicable or would cause significant detriment to the goals listed in subsections B through E, the Commission must refrain from establishing such districts. Conversely, if it would be practicable to draw competitive or more competitive districts, and to do so would not cause significant detriment to the goals listed in subsections B through E, the Commission must establish such districts. The direction that competitiveness should be favored unless one of two conditions occurs does not, contrary to the Commission's assertion, mean that the competitiveness goal is less mandatory than the other goals, can be ignored, or should be relegated to a secondary role. And mind you, I am not saying it is less or should be relegated to a secondary role. But Chief Justice McGregor at the time said the constitutional language means what it says. The Commission should favor creating more competitive districts to the extent practicable when doing so does not cause significant detriment to the other goals. And I would suggest that that opinion, along with the Constitution, does provide a hierarchy of the criterion within the Constitution of Arizona. So, as a whole, CD1 is significantly, for instance, less competitive than the current CD1. The fact that the 2010 election year was used and not going back to 2004, 2006, 2008 seems to be a difficulty because 2010 was an aberration in that Republican candidates in Arizona received unusually strong supports from voters of all types. Believe me, Republicans would like to say 2010 was a normal year, but I don't think any political analyst would say that's the case. It was clearly an aberration. And as such, by emphasizing 2010 election results, without smoothing data from prior elections, the results of any competitiveness analysis become skewed. We would urge, one of the things that we requested in our memorial is that the Commission create a specific definition for competitiveness so that the term can be applied in conjunction with other constitutional criteria. I wish that your predecessors in 2001 would have done that, but they didn't do that, and I would urge you to do that. Let's talk about one or two other issues with regard to, say, incumbents and residents of incumbents and candidates. This is an interesting thing because, as you know, that's a strict prohibition against consideration of residents of incumbents. And I don't think anyone is asserting that this Commission directly considered anything like that. But there are two aspects that do seem interesting, at least two. The first of all is that over the course of a weekend, from Friday to Monday, 2 incumbent congressmen were moved into new districts. In one change, it appeared that there was pinpoint mapping involved, that may be down to blocking, block level of census tracts. The 2 Republican incumbent congressmen were affected by a map that was drawn apparently from Friday to Monday. That's interesting. There are at least 10 legislators who are drawn in or out of districts by a distance of a few hundred feet, including, frankly, the only Hispanic conservative in the entire legislature is on the corner of one intersection. And that's interesting because how did that happen? Other places where incumbents live where they're 30 feet away from the line. Their house, their front door literally is 30 feet away from the line. That is interesting as well. So the constitutional problem with that is it appears that maybe residence was taken into account, even though no one is asserting that you did that deliberately or openly. But one of the ways it could have filtered in is when you have maps submitted by groups. When you have maps submitted by groups, each group has, just like if I was to submit a map, let's not kid ourselves, as wonderful as I think I am, I would have a bias and I would be drawing a map to reflect what that bias is. Similarly, when you have groups that are trying to reach an objective, they will have a bias in the maps that they submit. And that has the potential of coloring what the IRC does. So if a group does take into effect or into account, say where incumbents live or particular outcomes, and they submit that map to this commission, without some pretty strict filtering, and I'm not saying that's easy to do, there's a chance that you will inadvertently violate the Constitution because their incumbency would have, residents of incumbency, for instance, would have been considered. And so that's a list of reasons that we struggled and felt like there was problems with the draft maps that were promulgated by the commission. We as a legislature the position we would like to see happen is that the IRC immediately commits a new mapping process for both congressional and legislative districts that comports with the requirements of Article 4, Part 2, Section 1 of the Constitution of Arizona. I think I've given a fairly concise reading of our report and our position, and Madam Chair, I appreciate again the opportunity to speak, and I'm willing to stand for questions if you or your members have any.
Thank you. Any questions for Senator Biggs?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Freeman.
Senator Biggs, thank you for the presentation. You know, redistricting is something that happens once every 10 years, and it's easy to forget about what was going on 10 years ago. And what I'm getting at here is the perception of the public. The public probably doesn't pay attention to it. It's something that happens only 1 at 10 years. It's kind of in the area of the political arcane or obscure. And while I know the commission has done its best to hold its meetings in the public and get the word out, my impression is, at least people I talk to, they don't know what I'm doing or what this is about. I think it's my impression, at least in my own personal history, you wake up one morning and you get something in the mail and, oh, I'm in a new district. I wonder what happened there. And my concern is that when, you know, the commission is not to consider the residency of incumbents, like you said, we're constitutionally prohibited from doing that. But we're also charged with upholding public confidence. And I don't think we're necessarily to turn a blind eye to that issue. And the screening, putting that in place, like you alluded to, I think would be important. But what's your thought of, I think one day, a day is going to come when the maps are finalized and people are going to get that letter in the mail saying you're in a new district. They're going to wonder why. They're going to wonder what happened to their representative. And according to your report, at least in southern Arizona, there were 10 instances where a member was either cut out or cut in a district by just a few hundred feet. Do you think that there will be some public concern if that were to be the way the final maps pan out?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioner Freeman, for that question. You know, in a democratic republic, public opinion is absolutely one of the strongest drivers of whatever policy making, and you are, if nothing else, you're creating policy when you create maps. And I think that you're right. I think most people are so busy in their lives working and taking care of the needs that they're not necessarily, let me just give you an example. There is nobody more anonymous in my legislative district than me. Nobody knows, you know, you can go wherever you want, nobody knows who I am. That's one of the beautiful things about being in a legislature as opposed to being in Congress. And I would imagine the same is largely true for you. And so in the end, when we talk about public trust and upholding public trust, it will be outcome-based. It will be, in the end, what happens when the people do get notice, when they're going to vote, and they say, well, gee, what happened to what's-his-face? You know, he's not on the ballot. Well, I'm not in his district or her district anymore. I'm somewhere else. How did I get over here? Why am I going to this place with these people? I don't know. When we do public trust, and one of the things that becomes, and you guys become held up to scrutiny for that, is when we do see 10 people in Pima County, or we do see someone else they're sitting on the corner of an intersection, and they're in a completely different district, and that completely different district not only is not even their partisan their party, their political party affiliation dominant, it's significantly the other way. It's not even a competitive district, it's an overwhelming to the other side. Those things are the types of things that affect public trust. When you try to explain to someone, for instance, I happen to represent a portion of what, I don't even know what the congressional district is, but say Apache Junction out in that way, trying to explain to them why they are now going to be in a district like Havasu City. They're baffled. They don't get that, and it's difficult. And they say, well, who's to blame for that? Not to be, you're right. The IRC process is an arcane process. It's a conundrum for the world to get. But let me give you another example. If you have, there's a legislative district where a portion of Yuma, largely, let's say 50, 60,000 people in Yuma are put in a district with 130, 150,000 people from West Phoenix. The people in Yuma are saying, who's this person? Those are the things that, where the public begins to say, how did this happen to us? And that's when you talk about public trust, that's what people want to know is, how did this happen? And while you've had loads of public meetings, I think that people are going to wonder, how did this person end up right here? How did I end up right here? And that's the public trust. That's the misperception.
Any follow-up questions or other questions from other commissioners? Mr. Sturts?
Senator Biggs, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to come down and speak to us today. I watched a very interesting interview. In fact, one of the members of our audience today was a participant in the interview, and as well as Representative Art Hamilton. And one of the things that he had mentioned, and I wanted just to get your, this is within topic or within concept of topic, but he was talking about institutional memory. And the concept of institutional memory, of course, was been shortened because of term limits in the state. But institutional memory also crosses over into mapping and map drawing. And I wanted to get your thoughts on because part of the mandate, our constitutional mandate, is to scrub the state clean, begin at grid based on equal population, and then adjust those lines based on the 6 levels of criteria that we are mandated to follow. Some of those design decisions, and as we receive public input, have intended consequences, and some of them have unintended consequences. Some of the unintended consequences, unfortunately, in my opinion, are that we have lost, in some instances, institutional memory. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that concept.
Well, in my mind, institutional memory is, again, for a democratic republic, is critical because anybody can run. We're very egalitarian in that sense, and it's a great country because of that. That's one of the things that make it so good. But when you get the term limits, or to respond to your question, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, to respond to your question, there is a problem with institutional memory, and I'll tie this into, I think, the broader question you're asking in a second. But and what that problem is when you can serve for 4 terms and then you're gone, who has institutional memory? Why, comes ostensibly from, I'll give you 3 groups. Number 1 would be the staff of the institution. They have institutional memory because they outlive the legislator. Or, for instance, I was talking to someone about the DOJ. The DOJ's career attorneys, they outlive the different administrations that come and go. They have the institutional memory, and they take the things that they do very seriously. Similarly, the other group would be lobbyists. And you know, people get upset with lobbyists, but they have institutional memory because they've been around. They again outlive the legislator. And the third group, in many instances, is media members. I would say they used to outlive us. I'm not sure that I see a lot more turnover than I used to see, but they do it. Similarly, when you're drawing the lines on maps, and you're constrained because you can't consider where incumbents live, and that seems appropriate to me. But when you end up with 6 or 7 incumbents or 5 in one district, and it appears to be packed, and you're losing someone's going to be gone there. They're going to be losing that race that's coming up. You'll also lose the memory of those individuals who lose. And the result is that you lose institutional memory. And some people think that's a great thing to lose institutional memory in a political body. And others think it's an important thing to have. Because, you know, to be honest with you, we find ourselves rehashing some of the mistakes that were previously done until a staff member says, you know, by the way, that was tried 12 years ago, and this was the dramatic, negative results. So I think when you're drawing lines, you have the potential effect of really reducing institutional memory once individuals and current incumbents get lumped together, if you will. I don't know if that's where you wanted to go, but I'm trying to turn it to the issue at hand.
Well, Madam Chair, as a follow-up to that, it was most interesting. Madam Chair, as a follow-up to that, it was most interesting because Art Hamilton's feeling was that that has led to that institutional memory was incredibly important. And when I started looking at legislative lines, not necessarily from the legislator's point of view or from the senator's point of view, but from the public, or the residents that live within those districts' point of view. And very early on, there was a woman that came up and was tearfully giving us testimony because she was no longer going to be living in a district that she'd lived in for 10 years. And she felt very compelled by her representation, where she went to meetings, where she walked from door to door, who she represented, et cetera. And I felt that was very compelling testimony, and that whether or not from the institutional side, from inside the Capitol building or the legislative buildings, that's one level of institutional memory. But the public's memory as well. I've lived in our family home for 20 years, and I live in a highly uncompetitive district. That district is Legislative District 28. I live also in Congressional District 3, which is also a highly uncompetitive district. So I also look at competition as being something that my voice as a conservative is not being heard because my representatives don't reflect my basic values and would not take my voice up either to the state or but however, that doesn't change the fact that I love the lines and I love where I live, and I accept the fact that my neighborhood is most important, and I've accepted that. So from an institutional point of view, the neighborhood that I live in, the area that I live in, has great effect. Now, under the new maps that we're drawing, those are all going to be changed. The relationships and where the areas and neighborhoods that are going to be walking are going to be changed, and the people that are highly invested into the political process from the public's point of view are going to change. Give me your thoughts on that aspect from the public's perspective of institutional memory and how that's affected, how you see it.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Sturts. Just a quick story before I answer the question. I grew up in Tucson, and my congressman growing up was Mo Udall, and everybody around us voted for Mo Udall and Barry Goldwater, and you know, it seemed to me as I was growing up, you couldn't find two more disparate politicians than Mo Udall and Barry Goldwater. But that was what we did because we were used to it. We felt comfortable in that milieu, if you will, that political milieu. Well, it comes out to this as well. The testimony that we heard mostly was talking about communities of interest when we were doing our joint committee. And the reason that I think that was the number one issue was that you had mayors coming and say, you know, why are we being separated, or county members saying, why is this part of our county going? We don't understand. It doesn't matter. We relate to these people. And that's, I think when you talk about institutional memory of the public, they know generically who their representation is. Number two, they know who their community is. And there's a sense of community that will inevitably be lost. You can't be perfect in that way when you divide and reallocate lines. But they certainly want to continue as long as possible, as much as possible, with their friends, their neighbors, and the community that they're familiar with. And the sense of alienation that comes is essentially a denigration of institutional memory, for lack of a better term, of the public. It's gone. And so a sense of alienation sets forth, and I think in some ways it's one of the reasons that we have such political apathy. There are other reasons too. I mean, both parties are to blame for that, I suppose, but certainly it has one sense of it, because to be devoid of your previous community of interest really is problematic.
Any other questions for Senator Biggs?
Maybe one more.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Freeman?
Senator Biggs, you touched upon this when you began your presentation, but I just wanted to maybe hit it again, because this was something that was unclear to me when I read the constitutional provision, because of some of the language that's used. The Constitution says that the legislature shall be entitled to come before the commission to provide comment. It doesn't say legislators, it says the legislature, which is a body, through a minority and memorial report. Originally, I thought that should be majority report, but I've since learned that's a term of art that means something. Could you explain what the memorial and minority report is?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Mr. Freeman, yeah, the memorial is something that you vote on, and so that's what a memorial is. We use them all the time for different events or issues. But the minority report is if you have a disagreement with that particular document, you write a minority report and issue that. And I'm not sure that I like the way the Constitution's worded. I understand it. I think they should have just said there's a majority and minority report. But they didn't. They said memorial, so it required us to take a more formal action.
And that doesn't necessarily mean Republican, Democrat. That just means the memorial reflects the report of a majority, and the minority report reflects the report of a committee of the minority.
Madam Chair and Mr. Freeman, theoretically, it means the majority of the legislature has voted that out, and the minority is coming from otherwise. I would tell you that I think that this was done along partisan lines, party lines. So, did you, unless Mr. Campbell voted for this majority memorial? I don't think he did.
Other questions for Senator Biggs?
Madam Chair, thank you so much, and members, thank you for indulging me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to present, and thanks for complimenting our staff. We don't do that enough, so we appreciate that.
Terrific.
Thank you. So our next speaker is, I want to get the titles correct. House Minority Leader Chad Campbell, and he'll be presenting the minority report.
Hello, members. Thank you for having me today. Want to echo some of the comments of my colleague, Senator Biggs. First of all, the staff has been amazing in working with them. To the limited degree that I have worked with them and contacted them when I needed information, and I know some of our staff as well has contacted them. And they've been very professional, very responsive, and I can't thank them enough for all the work they've done. And I also want to thank all of you for the work you're doing. I think you guys have probably not been commended enough. You are citizens volunteers. You're taking time out of your busy lives. I know many of you have other jobs. You have family issues, family commitments. This is a very time-consuming and I think a very draining process in many ways. So I want to commend all of you and thank you for your work, because it really does mean a lot to the voters of the state and to the future of the state. You guys are setting forth the maps for the next decade, and the importance of that cannot be understated. So thank you very much for your work. And I want to say from the outset that I think you've done a very good job to this point. I think you have followed the Constitution and the intent of Proposition 106. And when I'm out around the state talking to people across the state, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, I can assure you there are many people out there who support what you've done and commend you for your efforts. And I know you guys probably hear a lot of negativity at these meetings sometimes, so I want to pass it along to you that there are a lot of people out there who support what you're working on and really appreciate all of the time and effort you put into this. So I'm going to briefly talk about the minority report that we submitted. You all have a copy of it, I assume, correct? Okay. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the majority report and some of the comments that my colleague, Senator Biggs, made today. And he is correct in assuming that I did not vote for the majority report. I know he was going on a limb on that prediction right there. So he is correct on that one. We had a difference of opinion, obviously, down at the Capitol in terms of how this process has gone and where it should be headed. And to be quite honest with you, I think that when I look at this process and when we looked at this process, I was not around 10 years ago. I was not in office. I was not involved in this process in any way, shape, or form. But I talked to many people who were. I looked at some of the previous documentation from the meeting. I've looked at the maps we have that we're working with today, the maps we've been operating under for the last decade. And when I look at this process compared to that one, it is a breath of fresh air. And I've talked to several people who are involved with it. The transparency, it's night and day compared to the last time. And I find it ironic and somewhat funny that many of the people who are complaining about this process this time are the exact same people who really dictated the process last time and really are responsible for delivering the incredibly gerrymandered maps we've been operating under for the past decade. And so it's unfortunate, I believe, that we're even here today because I don't think that we should be participating in this process as elected officials. I think the voters spoke loudly and clearly when they told the people or the elected officials of the state, get your hands out of this process. They did not want elected officials drawing their own maps, and they were very clear about that. And yet, unfortunately, some of my colleagues don't agree with me, and so here we are today. So with that in mind, our minority report focused on the Joint Legislative Redistricting Committee and the work that was put forth there. And to be very blunt, this committee demonstrated exactly why the voters of the state didn't want elected officials participating in this process. This entire committee, from the outset, was a process that had a predetermined outcome, and it was very obvious from the expert witnesses they brought down to the committee, from the testimony that was delivered, and in many ways, it seemed to be a forum to attack many other elected officials, and very personal attacks sometimes, and unsubstantiated attacks, as well as attacking you, the citizen volunteers of this commission. And we found that unfortunate, and we had expected that, and that's why the Democrats boycotted this committee from the beginning. We also realized that there were a vast number of speakers during this committee, both outside expert witnesses and, with all due respect, Republican staff, that seemed to either not understand the process and the constitutional requirements of the process or disregarded it altogether, and that was unfortunate. I can't speak to what was behind that, again, whether it was willful disregard or if it was just not having a grasp of what the process entailed. But either way, the outcome was the same, and it was a committee that was orchestrated in an attempt, I believe, and the Democrats believe, to once again gerrymander the districts to control one-party domination of the state. And we saw it time and time again with testimony throughout the committee, and again, that is why we did not participate. And I want to point out that it's very simple. I'm going to just backtrack a little bit here. It's very simple what we need at the end of the day from this map. It's a map that should reflect the state of Arizona, a map that should meet the Voting Rights Act requirement. That is all, nothing more. This state, as we all know, is broken into a third Republican, a third Democrat, and a third independent. That is basically the breakdown of voter population in this state. A map should reflect that, nothing more. As long as it meets the other constitutional requirements that Senator Biggs and others have talked about, then the map is doing the right thing. And I think that, unfortunately, that is probably the greatest mystery for myself and many other Democrats, is when you look at this map, the draft map, it really doesn't even reflect the current population trends of the state. It's still beneficial to a greater degree for the Republican Party, which is why we're so mystified as to why they set forth on this campaign to really undermine the process and attack certain members of this commission. And that's why in our minority report, and here again today, I will reiterate, and I'll briefly call on you to take a look at the legislative districts and make sure that they are meeting all of the requirements set forth in the Constitution, as well as instilling to the greatest degree possible competition while meeting the other requirements. And I think and I know that it can be done, and it has been done to a great degree throughout this process. The voters of Arizona deserve that, and they do not deserve what they have seen from the governor and the majority party for the past few months, which is just more partisan attacks and more partisan games. And it's very unfortunate, and I think that the voters of the state, as we've seen, are getting tired of it. But that's all I'm going to say about the maps themselves today, because, as I said at the beginning, I really don't believe the participation of elected officials should be, to a great degree in this process, it should be minimized as much as possible. And the voters made that clear when they passed Proposition 106. And so I want to comment on some of the majority report that Mr. Biggs outlined today and make some comments about what I think are concerns for us and should be concerns for you as well in terms of what they came back with from their majority report. So with that in mind, first and foremost, the Voting Rights Act, as Mr. Biggs pointed out, does need to be analyzed in terms of minority composition within districts and communities. And he talked about Dr. Hanley doing this analysis on these maps, but I want to point out that this did not happen 10 years ago until after the draft maps were submitted. There's no precedent for doing it prior to the creation of the draft maps. So his contention that it should have been done earlier than this is simply incorrect. And so I'm not sure where that is coming from, but I can tell you right now, again, it does not hold up when you look at what happened 10 years ago. When you look at contiguity, continuity, whatever you want to call it, within districts, that is completely subjective. And if you look at the current map, excuse me, if you look at the current map, the lines right now have no standard. There is no basis for many of these districts. And it's impossible to do so because of the current makeup of Arizona and how large a state we are. Excuse me. Excuse me, 1 minute, sorry. Excuse me. Because of the lines, or because of the size and geographic makeup of Arizona, there is no way to draw every single district in the state that would meet every single community of interest. It's physically impossible, and we all know that here. There is no way. And secondly, there is no definition, or there's no requirement, and by definition, a district is not in and of itself a community of interest. It cannot be. Again, that would be physically impossible. So to the point of Mr. Biggs' argument that you're not meeting the community of interest definition and you're not following, you're not getting contiguous district lines in place or geographically compact lines in place, you can't win on this argument. And so there's no physical way to do that unless you were to create more districts. That is it. And that is not within your purview. That is not within my purview. That is something we'd have to go back to the voters of the state for. 30 districts in a state this size is impossible to make sure you're protecting every community of interest or appeasing what every voter wants. You try to do the best you can, and you have to do that. But if you look at districts, legislative districts that are the size of 213,000 people, give or take, which is the current size we're dealing with the legislative districts, and compare that to many other states, you will see what I mean. Many other states, I was just at a meeting, in fact, 2 days ago, with a colleague of mine from Kansas. His districts are about 22,000 people. That's how many people are in each legislative district in Kansas. If you go to other states, most districts are nowhere near the size of Arizona legislative districts. And so if you want to talk about trying to meet the needs of every community in the state or every citizen or whoever it may be, the only way to do that is to create more districts. It is physically impossible to do so with the current parameters set forth. 30 districts in a state of over 6.5 million people. It's not going to happen. So please keep that in mind as you move forward. You cannot make everybody happy. And if you look at the current maps right now, again, there are maps or there are districts that make no sense to many people, I'm sure, including my own district probably. But it is what happened the last time because it was what the commission saw fit to do under their powers set forth by Proposition 106. And again, what they had to do because of the limitations by only having 30 districts. And then I've heard time and time again that competitiveness has been pushed up the scale, been weighed more heavily than some of the other considerations, and I don't see any evidence of that. We heard testimony to this effect in the Joint Redistricting Commission, or committee, I'm sorry, down at the legislature. But there's no evidence of this, and there's been no detrimental impact on this. I have yet to see anybody prove to me that any competitiveness considerations has actually caused any detrimental impact on this mapping process. And if it does, that will be decided down the road, I'm sure, by the Department of Justice, by a lawsuit, whatever it may be. But it cannot be decided arbitrarily by the governor or a majority of the majority party at the legislature. That is not how this process works. That is not what the voters wanted when they passed Proposition 106. And I also heard Senator Biggs, and I've heard others, talk about the fact that some incumbents have been affected by this. Some incumbents have been put into districts with other incumbents, or it appears that the lines were drawn secretively to protect certain incumbents. And he actually mentioned the fact that there were 2 congressional people from his side of the aisle that were drawn into the same district. And the bottom line is this: when you have 90 incumbents in the legislature, first of all, and the overwhelming majority, in fact, the supermajority of them, are from one party, they're probably going to have more incumbents drawn into the same district than those who don't have many people down at the Capitol. We don't have enough people down there to be affected right now, especially in the Senate. There's 9 Democrats in the Senate. It's very hard to draw 9 Democrats in the state of 6.5 million people into the same district. So, again, this is simple mathematics, physics, geography, whatever you want to call it. You're going to have more people from the majority party probably drawn into incumbent districts than those from a minority party. That is in the overwhelming minority, I might point out. And if there's some vast conspiracy being dictated by the Democratic Party, please let me know about it, because I've been drawn into a district with 4 incumbents myself, so I need to be told what's going on as well. And so at the end of the day, this committee, and I do want to point out, this committee, as Mr. Biggs said, there are certain people proposing maps, certain interest groups that have been proposing lines throughout this process, and maybe that's what influenced the current maps you guys are using as your draft maps. And it wasn't that it was done intentional, but it was just happened because of the influence of people coming down and submitting maps. Well, that's how it works. And if that hasn't influenced you, that's good, because public participation, public input should influence you. But I do find it ironic that Senator Biggs did say that, considering the fact that I can tell you right now, at least for the House Republicans, I can't speak for the Senate Republicans, so Mr. Biggs probably has no working knowledge of this, but the House Republicans have paid staff using taxpayer dollars that focus solely on redistricting. And they are at every meeting, from what I know. I've never been to a meeting. It's the first meeting I've been to. I purposely stayed away from these meetings because I didn't feel it was my place, but I came because I was called today to do so. But they're at every meeting trying to influence maps. And so if there's any group that's been trying to influence maps from day one, it has been probably a lot of elected officials who are trying to protect their own districts. And I think that that's unfortunate, and I think that goes against the intent of Prop 106 and the voters when they passed it. And so it is what it is. But at the end of the day, again, if you are in the majority party and you have the overwhelming numbers they have right now, you're probably going to be impacted a little bit more by these maps than those of us who don't have many numbers. Simple as that. And then to Mr. Sturtz, you mentioned that you had a lady crying because she'd moved out of her district. I can say I know plenty of people would probably be crying if they were left in the same district right now under this process. So, and I kind of say that as a joke, but again, there are certain people that will be impacted by this. And that's unfortunate, but that is the way it goes. That is the way the voters wanted this to work when they passed Proposition 106. They wanted to remove that special treatment away from certain legislators or for certain powerful individuals within a district that wanted to keep it the same way. That was the point of Proposition 106. And if we're talking about institutional memory, or we're talking about the impact this has had on the legislative process, we can have those philosophical conversations all day long, and I would love to engage in them more. We might agree on a lot of those things. In fact, I bet you'd be surprised. But that is not part of the purview or the job of this commission or Proposition 106. You cannot take that into consideration. It's as simple as that. And so the bottom line is, and Senator Biggs talked about the political apathy that impacts the state right now, and he alluded to the fact that maybe this has something to do with it. I think the political apathy in the state has to do with the fact that people are sick of partisan games. I think they're sick of self-serving politicians. I think they're sick of seeing districts that have protected incumbents for far too long. And so that's the bottom line. And I'm a bit confused sometimes by the attacks I've seen on you guys. They're unfounded. There was absolutely no evidence provided in the Joint Legislative Redistricting Committee to substantiate any of the claims made by many of the testimonials they received or by Republican staff members. And that was, I think, unfortunate and troubling for many of us on the other side of the aisle. And many people that are not involved in the Capitol as well. From the outside perspective, people see what's going on and they're tired of it. We see it. We've seen the polling. I'm out there talking to people. They're very fed up with this. They don't want politicians working to protect their own jobs when we should be creating more jobs, actually, for Arizonans. And so we believe that as you continue doing your work here, you're going to keep doing it in good faith. We have faith in all of you. I think that you guys all have very passionate outlooks on this. That's good. That's why you were appointed in the first place. You care about the state. You care about your communities, your current districts, whatever it may be. And so the robust debate that's been taking place is good. It's healthy. And actually, it's what we need more of in the legislature and what we need more of in elections. And the only way to get that is to get a fair map. Without that, you don't have the robust debate that the people of the state deserve. And we've seen that for the past decade, and we see it right now. One-party domination is good for nobody. I don't care if it's a Republican domination or Democratic domination. It's never good. We've seen it in D.C. We're seeing it now here in Arizona. We need to have maps that reflect the people and the populations of this state. And I believe, and the Democrats believe, in the legislature at least, that you are doing just that. And speaking personally, putting aside any of my colleagues' wishes or anything else, they can speak for themselves if they want to, I would welcome more competition to any and all districts, including my own. And under the draft map, I will have a much more competitive district. But I'm good with it. If it means more opportunities for voters to engage, if it means more healthy debate, if it means more choices for voters at the end of the day when they go to vote in the general election, then I support it wholeheartedly. And I'm not sure, and I can't understand, why so many elected officials seem to be afraid of it, to be quite honest. It's astonishing to me. So with that, the voters of the state wanted an independent process to draw maps, and I think you guys are giving them just that. They wanted to keep politicians out of this process. They wanted to maximize efficiency and fairness and minimize corruption. That's why they voted for Proposition 106. And I think we and the vast majority of Arizonans, as I've said time and time again, believe that you guys are doing just that. So please, stay the course with your work. Do not get caught up in the games that you're seeing right now and have been seeing. Accept this majority report for what it really is, and that's scripted theater that I think was, in essence, aimed at gerrymandering districts and really continuing one-party domination, unfortunately. And focus on the task at hand, which is making maps that reflect the population of Arizona. And do it, I want to stress this, do it in as timely a manner as possible. We have got to get these maps done. The voters and the candidates need to know we're less than a year away from the election. We've got to get moving on these maps. In all fairness to voters, there were some very good questions and comments up here from Mr. Sturts and Mr. Freeman about protecting voters and communities, and the best way you can do that is to get these maps done. We really need to have these maps out there so candidates can go out and meet with their constituents and talk to them about why they should or should not support somebody. That's part of the process. We need to have it done and in place. And at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, if you have created maps and you have the Republicans mad at you and the Democrats are mad at you, then you've probably done a really good job. So with that, I will once again thank you guys for taking my testimony today, as well as Mr. Biggs. And Mr. Biggs and I disagree on a lot, but we also respect each other and get along very well. So it was good to see him down here today. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Freeman.
Representative Campbell, thank you very much for coming and providing the minority report for us and presenting it to us here today. I have a couple of questions, and one of them, it's Senator Biggs mentioned you're a lawyer, is that correct?
No, I'm not. God, no. Please don't do that. It's bad enough being a politician. Throw a lawyer on there, and it's just a double negative.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, here's a question that I have that I've been struggling with myself. We've taken a lot of public comment, and I've heard people say, give a rationale in favor of competitive districts, and you've given some of that rationale here today. And one of the rationales supporting the concept of competitive districts is, well, I feel disenfranchised because I'm in a district where I don't have a chance. I've also heard that those people who are in the majority, their votes are less effective as well because there's no competition. It's a predetermined outcome. Voting, I think we'd all agree, is a fundamental right that we all have. And the Arizona Supreme Court has rendered an opinion in 2009 interpreting Prop 106, and it spoke of that this commission, to the extent practicable and where it doesn't cause significant detriment to the other goals, should favor the creation of competitive or more competitive districts. And the concern I have is where it looks like the commission has gone is to pack members of one party, my party, into certain districts to the detriment of people in the Democratic Party in those districts and to the detriment of the Republicans in those districts, to favor districts, the creation of districts in other part of the state that are more closer to balance, where it's more competitive. How are we to deal with that? Is that what we're to do you think, in your opinion? Or are we to, or does that language in the Supreme Court's opinion about favoring more competitive districts have meaning in that we're to apply that statewide? And I know you have to take the Voting Rights Act out of the equation because that's federal law, it's mandated, we have to do that. But for the rest of the state, shouldn't we be favoring the creation of competitive or more competitive districts to the extent practicable and where it doesn't cause a significant detriment to the other goals?
And to Mr. Freeman, thank you. Again, I'm not an attorney in all seriousness. I'm not an attorney, and I don't claim to be an expert in terms of knowing how to operate mapping software or anything like that. I don't do that for a living. So I can't speak to, in all honesty, I can't speak to what you all have, as a commission, have done as you move forward. That's your workings, and I've paid attention from the outside. I think you need to take competition into consideration to the greatest possible extent in every district you're creating. But I also think that there are, again, certain realities that limit you from creating competitive districts in every district. I think we all know that. Voting Rights Act being one of them. Just geographic populations being another one. There are certain communities that are much more highly concentrated with either Republicans or Democrats, as we all know. And I think at the end of the day, what you need to do, and I think that was seconded by the court decision, and I think it was the intent of the voters when they passed this initiative, what you need to do is try to balance out competition with all the other constitutional considerations as well as the practical considerations. And I don't know exactly what that means, but at the end of the day, I think if you have a map that reflects in terms of overall districts leaning one way or another or being competitive, that reflects the general population demographics of the state of Arizona, and when I say population demographics, I mean the voting population, obviously. And again, as I mentioned, we have a third Republicans, a third Independents, and a third Democrats, for the most part, with some minor discrepancies between all three. If you have a map that reflects those populations as a whole, you've probably done a fairly good job. But if you have a map that benefits one party substantially, then you haven't done a good job. And that goes for my party as well. If I were to sit here today and look at a draft map that gave us 20 districts, hands down, no competition, I would be adamantly opposed to it. You should never be doing that. The map should be reflective of the general population. And again, it's very hard to do with, I think, 30 districts in a state the size of Arizona. And I can't stress it enough. And that's unfortunate because that is what you guys have been given to work with, and you cannot do anything about that. So it does limit your ability to make competition practicable in every single district. So I think what you have to do is try to offset the fact that you can't do it in every district by creating as many competitive districts as possible. And I know that's probably a roundabout answer, but
No, and I wasn't trying to put you on the spot.
no, I know.
You're a pro, so I knew you could handle anything. But on that point of one-third, 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 it really isn't one-third, 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 though. It's about a 5 and a fraction % advantage for Republicans right now. The Independents have crept up into number 2 spot. And then do you know what that breakdown is after the voting rights districts are taken out of the equation?
And I agree with you. Trust me, I understand. Again, that's a limitation that has to be taken into consideration. I completely agree with you.
It's like 10, 12%,
yeah,
maybe more.
It definitely impacts your ability to do competition in every district. And so I sympathize with your limitations on that. And at the same time, though, I fully support the Voting Rights Act because I think it's a necessary requirement here in Arizona. So what you have to do is you have to try to make it as practical as possible outside of those districts that aren't VRA. And to be honest with you, I think for the most part, the commission has done a very good job with that. As I said, I don't want to get too much in it because I don't feel it's my place, but personally speaking, there are a couple areas where I think you could tweak to make, instill some more competition and still meet the other constitutional requirements. They're included in the minority report, so you can read that for yourself. But I think at the end of the day, what you guys have done has been true to the Constitution, true to Proposition 106, and most importantly, bottom line, is true to the intent of the voters. And that's what matters, what the voters want. And I can't stress this enough, you know, going back to some of the comments that Senator Biggs made in response to, I think, the question from Mr. Sturts about communities and how people vote and getting used to having certain representatives. If that's true, then, you know, unfortunately, that wasn't reflected in Proposition 106. The voters did not go to the ballot to vote for something that said, keep my district the same every time so I can have the same representative. They wouldn't have voted for term limits if that's what they wanted. The voters want competition. They've said it time and time again in this state. You look at everything they've done, term limits, redistricting, clean elections, whatever. They may have not worked in the way we all thought they might have worked, but it's clear that the voters have always wanted more competition in the state. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And I think if you talk to the majority of Arizonans, and if you look at the polling, it backs me up on this, they simply agree with that. There's no argument. So you have to take all of those requirements into consideration, and you have to take the Voting Rights Act into consideration, obviously. But at the end of the day, I encourage you all, and I hope you will, again, try to instill competitiveness into every district where it's possible to do so without breaking those other constitutional requirements.
You mentioned, Representative Campbell, that the Joint Legislative Committee, in your opinion, had a predetermined outcome, that it was just theater. You also mentioned that the majority party has had employees or operatives here at our hearings. Do you think this commission has is that what we're doing is just theater, that there's a predetermined outcome? And does the Arizona Democratic Party have employees here at our hearings?
First of all, I don't believe there's been a predetermined outcome by any stretch of the imagination from this committee. Again, this is my first hearing I've ever been to, physically. I've watched many on TV and followed up with what's been going on with notes and everything that you post on your website. But I've intentionally stayed away because I did not feel it was my place to inject myself into the conversation as the House Minority Leader. I felt that if individual legislators wanted to come and speak to the commission about their district, their communities, that was within the scope of their power, and they should do it because they're representing their district. I did not feel it was my place to do that because I think I'm probably a little more political, at least perceived a little more political than some other people, so I wanted to stay away from it. So I don't believe there's been a predetermined outcome, though. I mean, I can tell you, the map that you guys have drawn looks nothing like the map I would have liked to have seen. So, and as I told you, my district gets tougher for me. I'm in a district now with 4 incumbents, and I've lost a lot of Democrats. But I'm okay with that because that's your decision. That's not my decision. It's not anybody else's decision. That's an elected official. It's certainly not the governor's decision. You guys need to do that work. And does the Democratic Party have people working on this? Certainly. Does the Democratic Party is it funded by the taxpayers of Arizona? Definitely not. I would hope the Republican Party has people down at these meetings, and I hope they're paying for it with private funds. And there are state staff that should be working on this in the interest of their other duties that they do. We have legal counsel down there. All chambers do. All caucuses do. They should be focused on this without a doubt. We have certain positions that have overlapping duties. But I just find it ironic. I'm not making a judgment here necessarily, but I find it ironic that Senator Biggs' comments about people trying to influence the process by coming down to these meetings and submitting maps or submitting testimony. I just found that ironic when I think the only caucus that is down here at every single meeting from what I know and is using taxpayer dollars to do it is the House Republican caucus. I don't think the Senate Republicans do that. I don't think the Senate Dems do it. And I can tell you that the House Dems certainly do not have people at every meeting that are being funded by taxpayer dollars. My point in that comment, though, was, you know, if he's casting stones at other people, and I mean that with all due respect to Senator Biggs, if he's saying other people are doing it, I think that we all should look in the mirror, too, because everybody's doing it, and it's part of the process. But at the end of the day, I would hope that all of you disregard to the greatest extent possible any testimony and any input you get from people such as myself. It should be the general public dictating this process. It should be community leaders that are out there representing neighborhoods or other interests out there. But it should not be people who are going to be directly affected by the districts being drawn that dictate this process. The last thing we need is elected officials coming down here trying to solely protect their jobs. That is not why the voters passed Prop 106, and I can tell you that is not what the voters want right now.
The voters also enacted a proposition that provides for the legislature providing comment too, right? And that's why you're here to present the minority report. That's in the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution takes the extra step and says, it mandates this commission, it says shall consider the reports. So that was obviously, seemed apparent to me that that's part of the intent of Prop 106 as well.
Again,
And you're elected. I wasn't elected by anyone.
Yes.
And Senator Bick says at least he can walk, through the grocery store without being accosted all the time. Well, nobody knows who I am. I mean,
yes.
Nobody heard of me before this day. This is the first time I met you. This is the first time I've ever met Senator Biggs in person.
Yes.
Or even talked to either of you. I mean, you, as elected representative, a member of the legislature, I mean, you speak for a constituency as well.
Yeah, and as I said, I think it was the opinion of the Democrats that individual legislators should, and many of them did, participate in these hearings when you guys were out at their communities or around the state. And we had many people that did that. I know many of my colleagues in the House Democratic Caucus participated at that level. We did not feel that it was constructive to use taxpayer time or money to hold a committee hearings that lasted over a week, that really, in all essence, we knew from the beginning had a predetermined outcome. And I'll tell you why I know this. We were never consulted on the formation of that committee. I actually found out about that committee from a reporter calling me and asking me about that committee. I was never told about the formation of this committee. I was never contacted once about who would represent the Democrats on that committee, which is a breach of protocol. Leadership from the majority side always contacts leadership from the minority side to ask them who they want on any committee, be it a standing committee or an interim committee. We were not contacted about that at all. And so that was pretty indicative of what was about to come and what was about to transpire. And so we decided to boycott that committee. And we did our report probably in about an hour and a half. Didn't cost us much money. Didn't waste time. Didn't waste taxpayer dollars on numerous hearings. But we did watch the hearings, and it was obvious from the beginning. I don't think there was a single person that came to these committee hearings that gave any fact or any statements or evidence or whatever you want to call it that was contrary to what the Republicans had already testified and what they'd already said they believed about this commission process. So it was a predetermined outcome, and so we decided not to participate, and that was unfortunate. I would have liked to have participated in a constructive dialogue with my counterparts on the other side of the aisle, but in all honesty, I wasn't given the chance. As I said, I found out about this committee from the media, and that really is just, it was a breach of trust and protocol. Not just protocol, it was a breach of trust, too, for me. And so, with that being said, we watched this proceeding so we could make our minority report in response to what we assumed to be the majority report, and that's why you have it today. And at the end of the day, though, you shall consider what we've submitted. You shall consider what the Republicans have submitted, but doesn't mean you have to consider it to a great degree. You can do what you want with these reports. You can use them as scrap paper. You can take them home and study them and believe that they are substantive. That is up to you, and that should be up to you. It should not be up to us. And that is what the voters said when they passed Prop 106, is they wanted to get self-serving politicians out of the process, excuse me, and get their hands out of the cookie jar, so to speak. They wanted new districts. They wanted a new independent process that would instill, I think, a greater trust and a greater accountability with state government. And I think, unfortunately, that trust has been broken down substantially over the past couple months by the actions of Governor Brewer. We've seen the polling. I mean, less than 1 in 5 independents supported her actions on the IRC. It's obvious that the public was not on the side of some of the efforts we saw from the majority party. And so be it. That was their purview. Our purview was to stay away from this as much as possible. I came today because I was requested to do so, and I would do anything that you guys asked me to, because I think what you guys are doing is so important, and the amount of time and the amount of commitment you've shown is simply amazing. I wish many elected officials would show the same type of commitment and time that you've shown to this job. And so out of respect for the commission, I wanted to come here today and give you our side of the story. But please, at the end of the day, you can take my comments here today, our minority report, and you can do what you want with it because it's your decision to do so. I have no authority over any of you, and neither does any elected official in the state.
I don't want to monopolize all the time. I do want to sincerely express my thanks for you coming down and speaking with us. When I was appointed, I I felt like, the Constitution requires us all to be honest and use our own independent judgment and uphold public confidence. And I felt like I had to don a suit of armor, expecting the fusillade of arm twisting. It never happened, and I feel kind of left out. And so that's why I appreciate hearing from you and from Senator Biggs today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for serving too, Mr. Freeman.
Other questions for Representative Campbell?
I'll ask Representative Campbell one question. Thank you for coming. We've heard reference to a predetermined outcome. Proposition 106, as you've talked about, was enacted to, in large measure, to increase voter participation and candidate participation by creating fair and competitive districts. Right now we have a situation where we have 21 Republicans in the legislature, I believe.
In the Senate, yes.
In the state Senate. We have 5 Republican Congress people. If we do, as I believe we have been doing, attempt to create fair and competitive districts, which in my mind means districts in which in an average year, given average candidates, each would have an equal opportunity to win a race. If we continue in an effort to make as many districts as we can competitive, or as close to competitive as we can by that definition, I think that that effort is being conflated with a predetermined outcome. And somehow we are being accused of doing something wrong when we are in fact achieving the very thing that the voters want and the very purpose for which the voters enacted Proposition 106. And I wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, and thank you, Ms. McNulty. I'd probably agree with you. I think that, unfortunately, the attempt to create a competitive, or maybe just a more balanced map, a fairer map, has been confused with a predetermined outcome. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if it's been outside efforts and conversations with various interest groups out there that I think have been very active from day one on this. But that is simply not the case. And again, I think that protecting the will of the voters when they pass Prop 106 and protecting the intent of the voters, which was obviously to take politicians out of the process, is the key goal here. And so everything you guys have done is your own, it's your own doing, so to speak. I mean, you guys are the ones with the power, not me, not Senator Biggs, not Governor Brewer. If you guys vote, in whatever numbers you vote to submit a map or approve a map, whatever it may be, that is your decision. And if somebody's unhappy with it afterwards, so be it. There's other actions they can take to try to find recourse. We saw it the first go-round. We know what happened. It was held up in court for many, many years. We know that's happening in many other states right now. But trying to undermine the process from day one and confuse, I think, many people in the public and many other people in the political world with these arguments that cannot be substantiated was disingenuous at best. And it was very troubling to me to see it happen. And really, the personal attacks I saw on members of the commission, on other elected officials, was troubling to me. And that's unfortunate. And that's why I'm very respectful of everything you guys have done. And I think you guys have conducted yourself very gracefully in very intense, very pressured situations. And I will say that I think the overwhelming public testimony you received, and I want to thank every member of the public that's come down here and testified, whether they agree with me or disagree with me, they're participating, and I want more people to participate from all walks of the political world. And I wish everybody in Arizona and everybody in every community in the state was at these meetings talking to you guys, telling you what they wanted to see. So I thank every citizen that came down here throughout this process, whether they agree with me or disagree with me, to testify. That's their right, and that's citizen involvement. That's what we need more of. But again, to use some of the tactics that I've seen being used from day one by certain elected officials, by certain special interest groups out there, has been very disheartening to me, and I think very disheartening to the general public. And again, you've seen it in the polling. We've seen multiple polls that have shown that. And I think you're seeing it in another movement right now that just popped in my head, the OpenGov movement. There is a movement now to create nonpartisan primaries in this state. And that is a direct reflection of what the voters are tired of. They're tired of partisan games. Political apathy in the state does not exist because of what you guys have done or because of bad maps. It exists because people are tired of both parties. They want real leadership from their elected officials. And the best way to do that is to give them real choices when they go to the ballot box every November.
I got it now. It's been my sense, traveling over the state as we have for this process, that it kind of confirms my belief that Arizona is a very diverse state, but at the same time, at the end of the day, we all have a lot more in common than we are different. And the concept of communities of interest is talked about an awful lot in the context of this process. And the drafters have testified that what they intended when they used that phrase was that if there was a historic district or a minority community or something like Guadalupe perhaps here in the metro area, that could be kept whole by moving a line, that we should do that. And when you look around the country at definitions of community of interest, it's that sort of definition. The definition is not, as you said, that a whole congressional district is homogeneous, or that Lake Havasu City has to have something in common with Naco, or those kinds of things. I live 3 blocks from the edge of a congressional district, and it just seems to me that when we're all done, everyone is going to have a transition period, and then everyone's going to be comfortable with the new lines. And so I guess I would ask you to comment on that. I guess you've been through some elections and probably have a sense of that as an elected official. The transition is a little disconcerting, but then it's the way it is, and it's all fine, and I expect it all will be.
Yeah, and let me step back. Let me talk about this from a different perspective. As opposed to being an elected official, let me talk about it as being an Arizonan. I'm a native Arizonan, been here my whole life. I don't plan on going anywhere else. I just got married, plan on having kids soon, and I want to stay in Arizona because it's, to me, the best place I've ever seen, ever experienced in the entire world. And there's a lot going for it. And when I'm out traveling the state, and I travel the state a lot, I'm both for political work as well as just personal enjoyment. I've worked in southern Arizona, I've worked in northern Arizona, eastern Arizona. I know the state, I think, as well as almost anybody out there. And Arizonans have a lot in common, much more in common than they do in terms of differences. And unfortunately, it's been exploited, I think, by certain individuals in the political realm over the past decade in particular. And we've seen that. And so most Arizonans, when I talk to them, be it here in Phoenix, be it up in Flagstaff, down in Sierra Vista, wherever I am, they really don't care who their elected official is. All they want is somebody that's actually doing their job. They don't care whether it's me or somebody else that's representing them, as long as it's somebody that's actually responsive to them, has an open door, actually cares about the issues facing their communities, their neighborhoods. That's what they care about. And the overwhelming majority of Arizonans have absolutely no idea who their legislators are, which right now with the approval rating for the legislature is a good thing for me. That was a joke. You can all laugh. It was, kind of funny. And in all honesty, most people don't even know probably who their congressional person is these days. They know the president. They know the governor. They know maybe their U.S. senator. Most people are not involved to that degree. But what they are involved with is their community, and they're involved with their daily lives, feeding their kids, getting them to school, getting to work. They want people that understand those challenges they're facing. And the only way to do that is to try to remove the partisanship as much as we possibly can from the electoral process. And I think that we've attempted to do it many times through the Clean Elections Initiative, through term limits, with Prop 106. And I think Prop 106 has been probably the most successful attempt so far. At least I hope it will be. And you're seeing it now with the Open Gov Initiative. People are sick of partisanship. They're sick of these games. And so at the end of the day, I am an elected official. I have gone through several elections now. So I do talk to people, and I think obviously the majority of my voters, I think, support me, otherwise I wouldn't get reelected. But really, if it was somebody else that could come in there and do a better job than me, and they proved it to the voters would oust me in a minute. I'm not a family member. I'm not their best friend. I'm an elected official, and I'm their employee. And if I'm not doing my job, then they're going to kick me out of office. And the only way for that to happen is to give people real choices at election time.
Mr. Herrera?
And I apologize for my throat. I was out of town the past couple days and came back to Phoenix. It was like 34 degrees. I have no idea what happened, so I apologize. It's dried up my throat, though.
I apologize for my throat as well. I have the same thing. We must have been together somewhere. Yeah, I apologize for missing a good chunk of your presentation. I was trying to listen while I was at work. I do work, by the way. I'm a volunteer. So I apologize for missing a good chunk of the meeting. But I wanted to ask you, you may have covered this. I know you weren't a politician. You weren't an elected official 10 years ago. But there was a Democratic governor, I think, 10 years ago. I think Jan Napolitano was the governor.
Well, no, she wasn't actually during the time this was going on.
No, but she was in 2004 when a lot of the
Yes.
And there was some accusations that the chairperson really was not truly an independent. I think I was hearing that. Do you remember the governor ever taking any action as the current governor did?
No, and I kind of alluded to that earlier. But when you go through this process 10 years ago, we had the exact same arguments being told today by other people who were upset with the process. You know, the independent chair wasn't independent. There was secretive meetings happening behind closed doors, et cetera, et cetera. And in all honesty, and I said this earlier, if you look at what happened 10 years ago compared to how you guys have handled this, it's night and day. The transparency level of this commission is through the roof compared to what we saw a decade ago. But regardless of that, I think that you saw elected officials the first time around who respected the process, and they waited for the maps to actually go to draft status, analyze them, get finalized, be submitted, and then they took the proper recourse, which was to, of course, you have to go to court if you don't like it. That is how the system works. We all know that. But they should not be interjecting themselves. This is my belief, and then I think I can speak on behalf of my entire caucus. Elected officials should not be interjecting themselves into trying to subvert the process. Can they come down here and give testimony as to what they would like to see in their area? Certainly. If they see that as being the best way to serve their constituents, I fully encourage them to do so. But they should not be trying to interfere in the daily operations of the commission, or how you handle your business, or what type of parameters you set forth in terms of the process you're working with, because that is your purview. It was set forth by the voters, and it was certainly established by the Supreme Court decision.
I have a follow-up question. You know, I heard during when I was at work that Senator Biggs mentioned that we should adopt some definitions, and I forgot which definition in particular. I think it was communities of interest. I don't recall 10 years ago that the
Competitiveness.
it was also communities of interest. I think it was both. I don't recall 10 years ago, and I don't remember if Senator Biggs was in office 10 years ago, but I don't recall politicians, especially Republican politicians, asking the commission 10 years ago to adopt definitions, like set definitions. As a matter of fact, I think they were pretty adamant that they weren't going to do that. Even the Republican attorney, Lisa Hauser, was adamant that they didn't need to do that. Do you recall that?
You know, I don't recall whether or not there was any calls for that type of activity from elected officials. So I don't want to speak to that because I don't want to misspeak. But again, I will just reiterate this. You guys are set forth by Prop 106, by the Constitution. You're appointed. You've gone through the process that was put in place by the voters to do this work, and it has been made crystal clear by the language that 106 contained, as well as the court decision subsequently after Prop 106 passed, that you are the ultimate arbiter for the most part in terms of how you work, the decisions you make, the definitions you create or don't create. It's your job to do it, not ours, not the governor, not attorneys on the outside. It's your job. And I think you probably missed this earlier. I'm going to reiterate this. Everything I've said today, you know, I hope you guys are listening to me. Great. But if you're not, no problem as well. I trust the process. I trust you guys as commissioners, and I trust that the voters knew what they were voting on when they voted Prop 106 into place. And I, as an elected official, will not attempt to try to subvert that process, and that's the bottom line for me.
Madam Chair?
Questions? Mr. Sturts?
You had said at your opening statement that you had felt that the last IRC created maps that were gerrymandered maps. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. That IRC followed the same constitutional process that we're following. Would you say that the public, when they voted for 106, were they duped to create such a process that would allow for a commission to create a gerrymandered map?
No, I would not say they were duped. I think the public knew exactly what they were voting on. And I think, as I said earlier, the process the first time around, from what I know and from all of my investigation and conversations with people involved the first time around, was very different than the process you guys have undertaken this time. And I think that if you look at the legislative maps in particular, I actually think the congressional map was pretty fair last time. I think it's still fair today, to be honest with you. I don't have any problems with the congressional map. I mean, we have to add a new district, but in terms of being balanced, I think it's fairly balanced. We've had a pretty balanced delegation that's gone back and forth between both parties for the past decade. The legislative map has not been the case, and if you look at the way it was handled last time, there were certain, I think, assumptions made, and probably misstatements and misinformation given, maybe not intentionally. I'm not trying to impugn anybody, but misunderstandings, whatever you want to call them, in terms of what the Voting Rights Act meant and how it related to drawing maps. And what you saw was super PACing of certain communities of interest, in particular Latino communities, drowning out their voice. My district was supposed to be a majority-minority district. They've had one minority representative in the legislature over the past 10 years. And that's just not right. That was not how the process was supposed to go. And so, you know, I don't want to look back. I think we need to move forward. But at the end of the day, I think the process was handled for various reasons. And a lot of it being it was just the first time, I think, and people were still learning as they went. But I think it was handled for various reasons incorrectly the first time. I think you ended up seeing the result of that in maps that did not reflect the general demographics of the state. And unfortunately, you know, that was the outcome, and the lawsuits that were brought forth didn't win. But again, as an elected official now, and I wasn't one back then, but I know I have many friends that were, there were no elected officials that tried to intervene in the process and subvert it from day one and undermine it. They waited and followed the correct protocol to have their voice heard and then let it play out in the court system, which is what is supposed to happen in this process. And were the voters duped? No, not at all. You know, nothing is perfect in this world. And I think that the voters, in their efforts, as I said, with all these other measures, and including the open gov measure that we're seeing brought forth now, the voters are trying to perfect a system that does not reward partisanship or extremism. And I think that's an ongoing effort, and it's one that I fully support.
Madam Chair, as a follow-up, what you're suggesting is that in the original commission, as it was, as the Proposition 106 when it was presented to the public for its vote, said that part of the preamble was to create fair and competitive districts and to essentially pull it out of the hands of the legislature to keep away from gerrymandering. Though that phrase, that preamble, never made its way into the Constitution, so the words fair and competitive, that phrase doesn't exist anywhere in the Constitution. Therefore, we're not following Proposition 106. We're actually following the language written into the Constitution. That was how it was adopted. But if they actually did follow that process, and they did follow it in such a way as they were not, as you suggested, that there was no outside influence, that there was no one that was coming to give them any, pulling them in any particular directions. That's the reason I'm asking the question. Was the process itself, because it seems to me that if you're liking how the process is happening now into this commission, which has been under a high level of scrutiny and has had a tremendous amount of outside influence as you're describing it, and you're appearing to say that it's a better process now, that the outcome is a better process now than it was when it was no contemplation of any outside forces, and they waited until the very end until they became involved. Yet that group, which was following a very independent process, created what, as you described them, just to be a gerrymandered map, which you had to follow for 10 years. Yet this process, which has been highly impacted, is a better map, in your opinion, or a better process, in your opinion. I'm trying to reconcile those two ways of thinking.
Yeah, let me clarify a couple things, Mr. Sturts. So I didn't say that the commission wasn't influenced by any outside forces. There were plenty of outside forces at work in the first go-round, from what I know, and many of them much more secretive than some of the things that we've seen this time, unfortunately.
Could you describe some of who those outside forces might be?
I'd rather not get involved. Again, I don't want to look in the past too much, and I don't have any evidence for me to substantiate anything today. Let's just say there were forces both in terms of public input, that was open testimony, as well as others, that obviously influenced the course of the first commission. But the difference, I really want to strongly underscore this, The major difference that you had was you did not have elected officials trying to actually overthrow the work of the commission while it was in the process of still drawing maps. You did not have that. There was no attempt by a sitting governor or by a sitting majority in the Senate to try to overthrow the work. There was no partnerships with outside organizations that I know of from elected officials to come down and try to influence the process from day one, which we know has been taking place this time. That was the biggest difference, I think. And in terms of the outcome, I have no idea what the outcome of this process is. You guys aren't done yet. I'm not saying the outcome is better. I have no idea what the outcome will be. All I'm saying is the process has been better from this point, from my point of view anyways, and has been from day one, at least in terms of your work. Unfortunately, I think some of the behavior of elected officials, that has not been the case. But the outcome is unknown to me because you still have not submitted any final map. So I cannot speak to the outcome. And I will probably tell you, you'll never hear me speak to the outcome because that's not my place. Again, I was told by the voters of the state to get my hands out of this process, and I respect that. And people can argue whether or not that's exactly what's in the Constitution or whatever, but we all know that was the intent of the voters. The voters wanted to remove politicians from the process, and I can guarantee if you go out there and poll the public, you'd probably have 85% of the public that would agree with that statement. They do not want politicians drawing their own maps, and we all know the reasons why. So I don't know what the outcome is. I have no idea what the final map will be. And in all honesty, and this sounds a little cliche maybe, but I don't care. I trust your work. I want you to continue with your work, and I believe you're going to come up with a good map. And at the end of the day, if I'm not happy, then you know what I can do? I can find some people that aren't happy with me, and we can litigate. I don't see me doing that, but anybody can do that if they want to, because that is the way this process works. But to try to undermine your guys' attempts while you're still in the middle of this, when there's been no map that's been finalized, when you were still in the 30-day comment period, to try to undermine that and subvert that process, I believe was a breach of trust with the public and with every voter that voted to support Proposition 106.
Any additional questions? Mr. Freeman.
I'm sorry, I am a lawyer, and I wasn't here last week, so I guess I'm making up for it. And because I'm a lawyer, it often means have a seat and grab a pillow, because I don't know when to shut up. But you mentioned, you've praised the process here, and I know, but others have said, well, Democrats are unhappy too. Republicans are unhappy. Both sides are unhappy. They must have the right result. First of all, I don't think that, the Republicans, I think, based on Memorial, are criticizing the process and their maps. And there might be Democrats out there who are criticizing the maps. Preliminarily, I think that might be falling victim to some logical fallacy that has a Latin name that I'm not sure, that one side wants A, one side wants B, the end result must be right in the middle. That's not necessarily true. But as a politician, if one side was griping about what's going on, wouldn't it be politically stupid to run around and give each other high fives and say, hey, it's great? Wouldn't you just want to say, oh, we've got problems with it too? So you do build that sort of false equivalence between the two positions?
Of course you could. That's politics. So if you want to be skeptical and assume, again, that there's some massive conspiracy here and that there's some group of shadow people dictating this process behind the scenes, I guess somebody could believe that, but it's just not the case. And again, I'm the minority leader for the House, and my district is not good for me. If there was some great conspiracy going on here, I think that would probably not be the case. The simple fact of the matter is this map, I do believe, creates a lot of problems for my party and elected officials in my party. We have a lot of issues we're going to have to work out, just as many probably as the Republicans. And so are we happy with the map? No. And you'll see in the minority report that we submitted, we suggest some changes to the map at the legislative level. We didn't get involved in the congressional map. We didn't feel that was our purview. But there are some changes we'd like to see because we don't believe the map is fair yet. We still believe it benefits the Republican Party too much and disproportionately as compared to the population of the state. But I will tell you, never once have I had a conversation with anybody from my side of the aisle that said to me, or did I say to them, let's try to undermine this process if we're not getting what we want. We've never once had that discussion. And I'm not sitting here saying anybody on the other side of the aisle has done that as well, but regardless, it's happened. We've seen the majority party try to inject themselves in this process and insert themselves into dictating how the process went, which I believe was, again, a breach of trust with the voters. And to be honest with you, I think, not to make light of it, bordered on gross misconduct. There was no justification for the actions we saw from many of our elected officials a few weeks ago. And it was disheartening for me, because I think it, again, erodes the trust with the public, and we all get painted with the same brush. And I know there were a lot of Republicans down at the Capitol who did not agree with what was taking place. And unfortunately, we've all been tainted now by the actions of a few. And so, at the end of the day, what I want to see, and I keep hammering on this, but I want to make sure you guys hear my message. I want you guys to move forward with the process in the best way you see fit. You were all appointed because you're qualified. You were all appointed because you care about the state. You care about your communities. You wanted to do this work. And so I have to have faith in you. I have to have faith in you. Otherwise, what's the point of this process? If I don't have faith in you, then what's the point of this process? And so I'm going to trust you guys. And at the end of the day, if I feel my trust has been misplaced, there are actions I can take for recourse after the map has been submitted. And maybe I or others would do so. But I have to trust you guys. It is your job. And so I do not want to interfere in the work of the commissioners. It is not within the power that I have as a sitting legislator.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
I just have two more quick questions. You used the phrase before that everybody's doing it in regards to having influence or preparation, having people that are involved in one process or another. Could you elaborate on what you were referring to?
Well, there's no, I don't have a list of people when I say that. I'm just saying you have groups from all walks of life. You guys have been traveling the state. There are people coming to all these meetings talking about what they want to see in their districts, their communities, what they want to see in a map. My point is there's a large number of people and groups out there working on this map. You all know it. We all know it. Citizens, business groups, whatever it may be, civic organizations, whatever it is. There's plenty of people working on this map. But I just found it ironic that Mr. Biggs pointed that out, considering the fact that I think the one caucus at the Capitol that has solely dedicated staff using taxpayer dollars to work on this is the House Republican Caucus. I think the Republican Party has every right to raise money and try to work on this mapping process, just as the Democratic Party does, just as the Green Party does, anybody does. But, I just, using state resources is a little troubling to me, and I'll just leave it at that. But my point of that comment was, I think we should probably look in the mirror before we make any accusations towards other groups that are trying to influence the process.
And you were talking a lot about, Madam Chair, you were talking about, before about that this is a math issue. That when the Voters' Rights Act is obviously you had said earlier that the Voters' Rights Act is incredibly important to you, correct?
Yes.
When the Voters' Rights Act, from a math point of view, somewhere between, depending on which statistics that you read, somewhere between 75 and 80% of the Hispanic population is registered Democrat. And to create a district that is a minority-majority district, you end up taking a large chunk of the Democrat population, of the 974,000 registered Democrats in the state of Arizona. You take a large chunk of those out of the mix, which is, as Commissioner Freeman referred to, actually takes your basically 30% Democrat, 36% Republicans, and actually widens that gap between the two. If you were going to try to, in an effort to try to create competition, do you think that it has any benefit at all to try to take Republicans that may be balanced in an area where they logically balanced in a particular district, and extract them from that district, hyperpack them into an adjacent district in an effort to give a balance of Republicans, Democrats in its adjacent district?
I'm not sure if I'm qualified to answer that question, to be quite honest with you. so I'm not sure if I'm going to attempt to. I think that there are plenty of people, and you have many of them on your staff that are qualified to do that type of work, not me. Again, what I would say is the Voting Rights Act is very important to the state. I think it's very important to many communities and many individuals across the state, and we need to respect that, obviously, and we should respect it, both for legal reasons as well as I think moral reasons. But we should also try to balance out everything else we can, all other factors, to create as much competition as possible while meeting those other constitutional requirements and meeting the federal guidelines that are set forth by the Voting Rights Act. How that means you have to work with other districts, honestly, I don't feel comfortable enough in my technical knowledge to answer that question, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm just not an expert at this, so I apologize.
And Madam Chair, I was just going back to your original statement that this was a math issue of basically a third, and a third. But what ends up happening is that the math numbers don't work out anymore after the Voters' Rights Act comes into play. And the only way to get that level of competition that you're referring to, some of the attempts that have been made through some of the mapping suggestions have been actually to extract and hyperpack in an effort to create a level of balance or the appearance of a competitive district. And that's really what I was trying to refer to. So you don't need to go any further with that, but that's the context that I was referring to.
Madam Chair, if I may just say one thing to Mr. Sturtz's comments. Yeah, I agree with you. And actually, my point about the math, though, let's take it to another angle, from another angle. My point about the math is when we hear the comments of certain elected officials who are unhappy with the map and say that the other considerations have been taken into consideration, communities of interest, contiguous districts, compactness, things like that. My point is it's simply impossible, given the size of this state and only having 30 districts to work with, it is simply impossible to make every single district and every single person in the community in this state happy. It's just not going to happen. And if you want to try to do that, then we need to go back to the voters of this state and say, let's double the number of districts, let's triple the number of districts, whatever you need. But when you have to put 213,000 people into one legislative district, which is what we're required to do, it is impossible to protect every single interest out there. You're going to have people that are unhappy for completely apolitical reasons. And unfortunately, though, that is just, as I said, the simple math of having 30 districts in a state that is as large as Arizona.
And Madam Chair, I wanted to thank you very much, Representative Campbell, for coming down today.
No,
I didn't get a chance to thank you earlier. So.
Madam Chair,
Ms.
sorry,
McNulty?
I need to ask you a follow-up question. I'm sorry to keep you here so long.
No worries.
But you did just say to Mr. Sturtz that you agreed with him, and I want you to be clear about what you agreed with, because I think we're all up here testifying now, and a couple of the statements that Mr. Sturtz made about hyper-packing Republicans. I mean, there may be a hyper-packing fairy here that we haven't met, but nobody's hyper-packing anything. And I don't think that the numbers are quite as stark if you look only at districts outside of the voting rights district from a one-third, one-third, one-third perspective, as it's just been suggested. So when you say you agree with Mr. Sturtz, I'd just like to be clear that I don't think that's the concept you're agreeing with, and I'll let you speak for yourself.
And Ms. McNulty, no, I agree with Mr. Sturtz in terms of the importance of the Voting Rights Act. That's what I was agreeing with.
Thank you.
But I will say one thing. I've seen plenty of maps that have been created. I think probably you're all familiar with some of the citizen efforts that were put forth to allow people to draw maps and submit them. I saw many of those maps. I've had many people bring me maps and show me what can be done. So I have no doubt in my mind that you can protect the Voting Rights Act requirements, you can protect communities of interest to the greatest degree possible, as well as meet the other constitutional requirements, including instilling competition in a much larger number of districts than what we see currently in this state, which is virtually nothing right now in the current map we have. There's no doubt about that. There's plenty of maps that have been floated around out there that I've seen that do it. So it's not just some hypothetical theory that I have. It's a fact. You can balance VRA, Prop 106, the Constitution, with competitiveness and meet all those requirements. No doubt about it in my mind.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturtz?
Just as a last point of clarification, do you think that it's that would, and when it goes to hyperpacking, I'm referring to a district with a 97.8% Republican over Democrat voter registration advantage that was created by wrapping around around Maricopa County to be able to pick up high density of concentrations of Republican districts. That's what I'm referring to about picking and choosing about high concentrations in an effort to be able to offload as many Republicans into some districts in an effort to dilute the amount so there'd be an equal amount of Democrats to be able to create some competitiveness in other districts. And I'm just saying to you that that's a matter of the math, that's the math issue that I'm referring to. That when we go down to the math, after the Voters' Rights Act is completed, the math is much, much more difficult to do to make it actually to play out as you've been suggesting. So,
I would say I know your work is difficult, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. It can be done, and I think that again, I have full faith you'll do it.
Madam Chair.
Mr. I was going to call you Mr. McNulty. I'm sorry, Mr. Herrera.
Yeah, I want to thank Representative Campbell and Senator Biggs for being here, and I know they're both busy men, so I guess it seems like we're asking them the same questions over and over again, but it seems that way to me. Can we move forward the agenda then? And I know Mr. Representative Campbell's a busy man. I know he's got some more to go. But if he doesn't, you can stay here all night if you like.
Are there any other questions?
No, but I will make a comment. The district that Mr. Sturz referred to has about a 40% Republican registration, not 97%. Just want to make that clear.
Any other questions or comments? Representative Campbell, thank you very much for coming, and Senator Biggs as well. I'm not sure how the last commission did this in terms of accepting the report from the legislature, if they had a presentation, but I personally appreciate you guys coming down and doing this, because it's much more interesting to hear from you directly and in person, as opposed to just reading the report, and not to take anything away from the report or whoever wrote that. And I hope you'll extend our gratitude to your colleagues and ensure that they know that we'll be taking this into consideration, both those reports.
I will. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, before we move to the next
Mr.
agenda.
Canfield.
Thank you. My understanding was there was no legislative report the last round, just for the record. And also, both Senator Biggs and Representative Campbell at times during their presentation referred to their districts, but not to their specific places of residence. So just for the record, and I know the commissioners all understand this, but their residences are not to be considered. So just want to remind the commissioners of that. So.
Thank you. Okay, we probably need a break. I think we're going to be ending, well, it's 4:25 p.m.
Sure, Madam Chair. I think the meeting is scheduled. I think we have to be out of this room by 5 p.m. I think
Is
that's
that
what I was
so?
told. And if that's the case, let's push forward with some of the, because I like to present some of the changes that I presented, if at all possible.
Okay, let me check with Mr. Bladine.
Madam Chair, I believe that it's more of a scheduling issue that people need to leave, in this case, tomorrow night. Tomorrow we do have a 5 o'clock scheduling problem of the room, but tonight we had a couple commissioners that couldn't stay past the 5 o'clock time.
Okay, and we could keep going. I mean, if we have a quorum. I don't know who's got to go, but anyway, I think Marty needs a break. Yeah, so we will just take a quick 5-minute break.
30
It's
seconds.
4:26 p.m.
30
Oh, wow,
seconds.
okay.
Let's do 30
1
seconds.
minute. It's 4:26. My mic isn't working. There we go. And we're back into public session. The time is 4:28 p.m. And we have concluded item 2 and are going to move into item 3, discussion, direction to mapping consultant, and possible action regarding adjustments to draft congressional districts, and possible action regarding adoption and certification of final congressional districts. The next item is of the same thing, but for the legislative map. So I think some commissioners, I think our mapping consultant did some work for us since our last meeting, and we thought we'd talk about some of that and then see if any commissioners had additional ideas to suggest. So, Mr. Strasma, are we waiting for Mr. Desmond?
We are, Madam Chair.
Okay,
Calling now.
okay. And I think since we're going to be concluding or wrapping up around 5 p.m., a number of these items will shift to tomorrow, like the executive director report, discussion of possible future agenda items.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Herrera?
There's some, you have in front of you some changes that I proposed and worked with Willie Desmond last night, all day yesterday pretty much, and I The reason I wanted to present them today is I wanted people, the commissioners, to be able to review them hopefully tonight, and then have some comments by tomorrow. So.
Okay, as soon as Mr. Desmond's back, we will talk about those. While we're waiting, I wonder if we should jump ahead to the public comment. I only have 2 request to speak forms. 3, there's another one in the audience. So is Ted Disbrow here? Representing the Dobson Association. Thank you.
There's only 10 of those, Michelle, so you may need to pass them around a little bit.
Oh, thank you.
First of all, I will say I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a politician. Can you need to get a little closer?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
And if you could spell your last name for the record.
My last name is as D as in dog, I-S, B as in Brown, R-O-W. I am the president of the Dobson Homeowners Association. What I want to clarify is that our community of Dobson Association is unnecessarily divided by the map as it's currently drawn, and I'm specifically talking about districts 26 as it's currently drawn and district 18. If you look at the first map that's in front of you, it is the proposed map, as I would propose a change in district 26 and 18. The current district is drawn along Baseline Road, which doing that divides some of our homeowners association because we extend up to the Route 60 area, if you're familiar with the area of Mesa in that particular location. I would also offer that the area that is in District 26 now is very isolated. It is cut off on the left by 101. It is cut off on the north by the hospital, by the community college, and by Fiesta Mall and the commercial area to the east of Fiesta Mall. So that area being represented by somebody in 26 will be very difficult because of their inability to readily access and represent the area as well as it might be with it being consistent with the Dobson Homeowners Association. So if you look at, now I'm going to take you to map number 1, which is actually the second page. If you look at map number 1, the area that is in blue that is above the Baseline Road, that is actually the area that is specifically Dobson Ranch. Okay, so I am proposing to move some area into District 18 that is beyond Dobson Ranch. I'm proposing to do that because of the isolation that occurs with drawing the district line across Baseline instead of at Route 60 in that particular area. Okay. I'm going to leave it with just looking at those two map areas. I will say that the other 2 maps that you have are alternate proposals that if the mapping group wanted to look at those and take them into consideration, they might consider them. When I look at the change that this would cause in the population, it would result in about 9,000 people moving from District 26 into District 18, it would result in about a 4.2% deviation from the ideal situation. Okay? I want to reemphasize that I think this is a good change because of A, we are trying to keep our district, our community from being divided. We do a lot of things in our community as a community as a whole. We do hold political forums. We do try to get our members to participate in the voting process, and we do bring the candidates into our area and ask for their participation. It's certainly easier to do that if we're in a unified district as opposed to being split into two separate districts. And I also would like the mapping group to look at the isolation that exists for that portion of what is now District 26 from the rest of the district caused by Route 60 on the one side, Route 101 on the other side, and all of the commercial property, so that there's really no easy way to access those residential communities that I'm proposing to move to District 18. Okay.
Okay.
Questions?
Thank you. Any questions?
I might
Madam
add,
Chair?
I have, yes, sir.
Mr. Freeman?
Just so I'm clear, map 1, I'm sorry, map number 3 is the proposed change.
Map number 3 is a proposed change, which basically takes north of baseline,
Takes it out of 26,
east
puts it
of
in.
101 and west of Extension, and moves it into District 18.
And the Dobson Ranch community consists of that area
That
alone, or?
Dobson Ranch is that area, plus some limited other. That's why I showed you map 1. Map 1 is the specific portion of that I'm proposing to move that is indeed in Dobson Ranch.
Okay.
Okay? I have shared this map, map 3, I have shared, so the mapping community can look at that shared map and incorporate it into 18, hopefully.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. With that, I think we're going to jump back to agenda items 3 and 4 so that we can cover some of this mapping work. And Mr. Desmond's back, and I'll leave it to you to tell us where you want to start. I know you did some work for us over the weekend.
Madam Chair, I was going to suggest that we defer discussion of the legislative voting rights districts until tomorrow and Friday when Mr. Adelson will be here. So it might make sense to go through Commissioner Herrera's changes that he referenced before.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, Mr. Adelson will be here for both Thursday and Friday meetings.
Sure. Thank you. And Mr. Desmond, can we start with the congressional map first? I think that's a little easier, and I think we can fly by that pretty quickly.
Yes. Buck, is there a clip for this microphone by chance? I guess before we get there, I just wanted to mention that the maps we're going to be discussing today and all the maps that have been looked at so far are, thank you very much, are posted online. There's 4 files that are going online. There is the block equivalency file, so people with mapping software can load these plans and analyze them. There's the PDF that was requested by the commission last time. A JPEG, or the PDF is actually the change report. The JPEG is a picture of the map that people can look at and print. And then coming online now, Buck's going through and posting them, are Google Maps. So just to quickly show that so people understand, the Google Maps that are available online, the districts as they are changed are the colored areas. There is a faint green outline that illustrates what the old district was. I'm not sure which one. So that if an area did change, the green line will be different than the border of the colors. So that's how people can see what the changes were. I'd give an example, but I'm not sure which one I just opened. So. But with that, I will go to Commissioner Herrera's maps. You'd like to start with the congressional?
Please. And before we start, I'd like to thank Mr. Desmond. He was very patient, and we spent many hours doing this, and I know he was hungry, but he chose to forego his dinner to be able to help out, so I can't thank him enough for all his help. Like I said, I'm not an expert, so I depend on the experts that we hired, and we hired good ones, so. When you're ready, let me know.
Okay. All right.
Let's start with the, well, first let me, again, I already said first, so second, let me say that that I had voted for the congressional draft map because although I wasn't 100% pleased, I think none of us were, but I think Commissioner McNulty has said numerous times that we created solid maps, and I agree completely. There were ideas that were Republican ideas, there were Democratic ideas, there were even independent ideas in the congressional map. There was a lot of public testimony taken into account. The 6 criteria were taken into account when we created this draft map. So I really, I'll be honest, I'm okay with adopting the map the way it is and not making any changes. But because I wanted to give Willie something to do, and he was anxious to help me out, I did make some changes to the congressional map. And let's start with the Oak Creek area first, surrounding District Number 1. There was plenty of public testimony that the village of Oak Creek belonged in with District Number 1 with Sedona and Flagstaff, and there was, I said, plenty of public testimony to that. So what we ended up doing is moving Oak Creek and surrounding areas to District Number 1. So that was roughly about 7,000 people moved from CD4 into CD1. Now, to equalize the population, we removed roughly 7,000 people from CD1 into CD4. So basically, the northern part, if you can point, go to Gila now, the northern part of Gila, which includes Copper Hill, Wheatfield, Claypool, and Miami, and then parts of Central Heights, Midland, are now in District Number 4. So basically swapped 2 areas. So the Oak Creek Village, the surrounding areas into one, and then CD1 gave the northern part of Gila County. Now with this, we kept Globe whole in District Number 1. And the testimony, I think we all heard plenty of public testimony that they wanted to keep parts of, or keep Verde Valley together in District Number 1, which we did. And I think these changes kept both rural districts, especially CD4, I think it was made more rural than it was before, and it kept CD1 as rural as the draft map. Now those are the only changes I made to the congressional draft map. It was minor changes, but I think changes that I could live with, and that was the congressional draft map. Any questions?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Freeman?
Well, I have a question. What were the Republican aspects of that map? Is it this thing right down there?
The 3 bordered.
That's it?
Let me remind you, and it's part of the public record that, and I think you were there, that Madam Chair used the whole county's map, which was, I think, your creation, and the 3 borders map, and then I think she used aspects of my river district map. So it was 3 maps that she used to combine that created the draft map. And again, I had approved and voted for the congressional draft map, and I'm willing to, if you don't like those changes, I'm willing to keep it the same as it was before, because I really do believe that we created constitutionally sound maps, and that's our main goal. We needed to use those 6 criteria to create those maps, and I think that's what we did. But again, I felt that maybe we can do some tweaking, and those are the tweaks I recommended. So, but you know what? If you're not happy with those changes, I would recommend that you make your own changes.
Oh, yeah.
You're entitled to.
You asked if there were any questions. I had one.
Yeah.
I've got a laser pointer right here.
I don't need a laser pointer.
And, I offered it to you back in
You've been
October.
gone for a while, so but let me remind you that
I've been here. I've been watching.
I think Chairwoman Mathis was very clear when she stated that she used the draft map to create the draft map. She used your whole county's map, Sturtz's 3 border district map, and also parts of the river map that I created. So
Here's the laser pointer. It's still here.
I'm happy to find those transcripts for you if you'd like.
So I was at all those hearings.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Okay, so that's the congressional map, and again, there's not that many changes, but I think those are significant changes that I would hope that the commission would approve. And again, let me remind you that we'll need a minimum of 3 votes to approve these maps, a minimum of 3. And as I suggested to the Chairwoman Mathis, that eventually, before we get to the final version, we're going to have to decide, okay, what changes are we okay with in the congressional and obviously in the legislative side? And and we'll have to probably vote on each change, I'm assuming, and I think that would work best. And that's fine. Then we'll get to a revised draft map, but then we'll have to vote on the final map to approve. And again, we'll be needing 3 votes for that as well. So just let me remind all the commissioners that that's the case.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Freeman?
Well, I have a conflict at 5 o'clock, so I'll be leaving, and it's on the agenda, so
Sure.
you can make your motion after I leave, I suppose. But it's a little disconcerting that after visiting canvassing the state, getting this public comment, taking all that into consideration, that's the proposed change. We swap Oak Creek for
Mr.
part
Freeman,
of Beale County.
these are my changes, and I'm entitled to them. And again,
I'm
I
not
haven't
disagreeing
seen-
with you.
I haven't seen you propose anything, and I would love for you to propose your own changes. And nobody's stopping you. You have chosen not to so far.
Mr. Freeman, excuse me, I've been gone for a couple days too, so if I could just jump in here
Sure,
and
of course.
ask for a point of clarification. Is this change that you've made, which I assume is one of the changes that you're asking for, you just made it this time. This is on the draft map, is that right? This is the congressional draft map reflecting just this change?
Commissioner McNulty, though, the changes were made to the draft map, and they were done step by step as I outlined. So they were done to the
Okay,
draft map.
all right, and no other changes were made to this draft map right now? We're at the point where we're just proposing changes still, and you're coming back
These
and
are-
you're showing us the changes on the draft map?
And
Okay,
I think
Okay.
Commissioner Freeman misunderstood. I wasn't saying that we were going to vote for them tonight, but eventually we will have to vote on some of these changes moving forward. But these are just my proposed changes. You may like them, you may not, that's fine, but I feel like I'm entitled to create, or basing it on public opinion, on public comments, and also the 6 criteria to make some of my own adjustments, as Commissioner Sturts has done, as Commissioner McNulty has done, and that's,
okay.
you
I
know,
just wanted to confirm we were still there in the process, that we're suggesting changes and we're evaluating how they would affect,
correct.
and making our own proposals about how our proposed change would affect other parts of the map, and that's what this does. You want to bring Oak Creek together, and so you've made a compensating
That's right.
change. Thank you.
That's correct, and I would like to also say in this process, we'd like to, if I can, if we all can, agree on the voting rights districts, which we talked about last week when we first started getting back together and talking about adjustments, because the sooner we can lock those in, so to speak, and you know, lock is a soft term as well, because we may have to go back and change things based on analysis, but we really need to get our final analysis done. We've done preliminary analysis of all the voting rights districts and talked about beefing them up in certain places and enhancing them, as Mr. Adelson would say. But it would be great if we could, as a commission, decide soon on what the voting rights districts look like on both maps, and then move forward with some of the other adjustments that we want to make.
Chairwoman Mathis, just to point out that the changes that I'd recommended did not interfere, did not mess at all with the majority-minority districts, both in the congressional and legislative side. They kept them as they were.
Right, and I didn't mean to infer in any way that they did. I just wanted to make that point that we really do need to get the voting rights districts locked in, and I'm hoping that through the work tomorrow and the next day with Mr. Adelson, we'll have some more ideas and be further down that road.
But in the interest of time, can we move forward to the legislative map?
Anything else on the congressional that anyone wanted to raise now in terms of either questions for Mr. Herrera or just other adjustments that you wanted to raise?
Not tonight. We'll be discussing this again tomorrow.
Right, we're meeting tomorrow at 11. Okay? Feel free to go to the next.
So if you can, Mr. Desmond, if you can bring up the legislative map?
Which way they go to changes in northern Arizona?
Let's talk the changes in northern Arizona first. What I did to make it as simple as possible, and this is Mr. Desmond's recommendation, which was a good one, is to make, you know, especially if they start getting to the point that we're making lots of changes, to create different maps for different areas. So we created a legislative map that is the improvements or changes to northern Arizona only. Let's see. Let me know when you're there.
I'm ready.
Okay. What we did is we wanted to incorporate or move places where people live, and this is in the Schultz flood area. And I want to make sure that I don't because I think there's been words thrown around and used interchangeably, Schultz fire and Schultz flood, and I don't think they're the same. I think they're I think the one that I'm referring to here is the Schultz flood area. So that's based on public testimony. Those that were in Flagstaff probably heard overwhelmingly that the Schultz flood area should be included with Flagstaff in Legislative District 6, so moved away from LD7 into 6, because it was a community of interest in the interests of the Schultz flood area that included Timberline and Fernwood would be better protected or represented by in LD6. So that was one of the changes that we made. That was the first change. And then the second change that I'd recommended was to add more of Verde Valley District into District number 6. So we kept Verde Valley whole, at least I think we kept Verde Valley whole in District number 6. Again, due to public testimony, I think that was overwhelming that Verde Valley fits better with the city of Flag in District number 6. And that would be, again, Camp Verde and some of the unincorporated areas of Camp Verde. So that's the second change. The third change that was made, so we moved all of Payson into District 14. And I think the city of Payson and the residents that were at the public hearing were pretty clear that they were more of a community of interest with Prescott than they were with Flagstaff. So that explains the move, the entire town of Payson into District 14. Let's see. Because with the changes of District 6, although more Republican, it has become slightly more competitive because of the changes, although it is still slightly more Republican because of the competition is one of the six criteria. It's an important one that we need to keep in mind, and I was doing that while I was making the changes. The fourth change, we removed the non-tribal areas of Mojave from District number 7, and we placed it into District number 5. This is again to improve the Voting Rights Act, to improve the voting rights strength of District number 7, which was something that the Navajo Nation and the Native American tribes in District 7 were discussing and had presented to the commission. Now, all these changes that I had proposed have affected District number 7, 14, 6, and 5. Okay? And right now we're studying the change report of Sholo and Winslow. And I think that Commissioner McNulty had proposed those changes. It was probably on Monday. And based on the changes she had recommended, I would agree with those proposed changes. So that was the changes to the legislative map in the northern Arizona area.
Can you repeat the last one for me, the non-tribal portions?
Sure. I think the non-tribal portions includes Colorado City and then areas around there that are not non-tribal and non-Native American. So they would boost the majority-minority or the voting rights strength of District number 7. So that's why we removed it and placed it in I think it was District 14?
District 5.
5, I'm sorry, 5, which has more in common in District number 5 than it does in 7. So.
It's a line that more closely reflects, I guess, the congressional district. So all of Mojave counties in that district, except for the Pi Tribe area.
Wasn't that one of the same changes that Commissioner McNulty had proposed?
One of the changes that she had proposed I think, moving Verde Valley into District number 6, I think.
No, I was referring, sorry, the parts of Mojave County north of.
I don't recall, but if she did, then I do agree with them.
Okay. I don't think I did propose that on Monday, but I think it's a good idea. I'd propose the Winslow-Sholo
I think
switch.
I think of all the changes that I
Yeah.
proposed, there was only one change that overlapped, I guess, even though I didn't really cover it. It was that
Okay.
Sholo change. Based on what you had presented and what Willie had given to us, I think I agree with those proposed changes.
So is the Winslow-Sholo switch done here?
Yes.
And what's the population now of LD 7?
Legislative District 7 is now underpopulated by about 13,000 people, 6.2%.
Okay, but that's a majority minority district, so.
Kind of following advice of Mr. Adelson.
So that's okay there.
Yeah, it has a total minority population of 75.4%, so an increase of about 0.7%. Voting age had a similar increase of about 4%, or 0.4%. So overall, we made this district.
So it's a stronger district.
It's a stronger minority district.
Good.
So in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move over to the Maricopa County changes. Now, there's some changes that Commissioner McNulty had made to 8 and 11, creating them, I guess, making the changes for them to become a little more competitive. And I didn't touch those areas because I agreed with your proposed changes. So let's go to Maricopa County. You know, there was two goals when I was trying to make some changes to those areas. One, the first goal was what I wanted to do was to start by removing splits from Glendale. I think Glendale was in 6 districts, and with the changes that were made, we removed 2 splits. I think that's important. That's one of the criteria. And the second goal was to make 28 a more competitive district. Again, one of the 6 criteria. And let me explain how we got there to fulfill those 2 goals. The first thing we did is we removed Glendale from districts 20 and 21. And then we put those areas of Glendale into District 22. Again, eliminating 2 splits, or it being split into 2 different counties. So 20 and 21, Glendale was removed. The second change was to balance population in District 21. We extended Peoria, or the portion of Peoria, more. Let me see if so more of Peoria is in District 21. So we added more of Peoria into District 21. So we equaled the population now with that change. The third change was we had District 20 had to take population from 22 in Phoenix around the areas of 59th Avenue and Happy Valley Road. So that was the third change. The fourth change was District 22 was still overpopulated, so it gave all of New River, keeping New River whole, to District 15, removing a split of New River, which there was a split before, so we removed that split, and it's now kept whole in District 15. The fifth change was District 15 shed some of its population to District 20, making District 20 and 28, I think those are the 2 districts, the only 2 districts that the legislative district is made up of entirely of Phoenix. So again, trying to keep it as whole as possible and not reaching into any other parts of Phoenix. So those are the only 2 districts, 20 and 28, that are entirely made up of Phoenix. And I don't think that was the case in the draft map, correct?
In the draft map, there were no districts entirely of Phoenix. District 17 was close, but had the portion of Guadalupe and a little bit of Tempe.
Okay. The sixth change was to, on District 15, we took all of Paradise Valley in District 15 and to trade population with District 28. So in order to make 28 a little more competitive. And so District 28 absorbed some of District 24's population following last week's recommendation to improve the voting rights performance of District 24. So Paradise Valley was still kept whole. So now, as I mentioned before, there's two districts that are entirely in Phoenix, 20 and 28. The seventh change is still trying to figure out ways to clean up the West Valley. It was something that we wanted to do, but it got a little late, so I felt that was something we could do later on with Mr. Desmond. But I'm not, again, not having the time. You know, for example, one of the things we were trying to clean up, and we did a pretty good job with that, is removing some of the splits in Glendale. So now it's in 2 fewer districts. And those are all my changes to the congressional map for now. Excuse me, the legislative map.
So has Mr. Desmond already started to do some of those? You've done them?
Right there.
Yeah.
They're all done?
And the change report is there to reflect these changes.
And we have the change report?
Yeah. You have all 3 of the change reports that.
Mr. Desmond, can you do me a favor? Can you talk about the, you know, obviously we're using the four state mandate criteria to make these changes, which is never easy. But we were able to create more competitive districts. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe so.
Can you go into some detail and explain some of the some information on the change report regarding the competitiveness of some of the districts we created?
Well, I guess specifically District 28 became more competitive following these changes. Some of the other districts that were already strongly one way or the other were strengthened. District 24 was improved slightly in some, I think District 22 started out as a very Republican district, was probably increased. Some of the districts that were already very one party or the other became more strongly that party. I can go through the change report specifically for each district if you like, or
Please, if you don't mind, specifically in the, obviously in the areas of Maricopa County.
okay. Okay, and just so everyone knows, this is the changes we're talking about here are the change report to adopt changes submitted by Commissioner Herrera. The new map is legislative draft change. Herrera changes Maricopa County. The districts affected were 14, 15, 20, 21, 22, 24, and 28. And that's available on the website. All of you have it printed out for you. Just quickly before we go to the competitiveness, just to point out District 24, one of our majority and minority districts, there was a little bit of addition by subtraction. So District 28 absorbed some areas there that helped improve both its Hispanic number and its ability to elect. So welcome to look at those. But that is one of the districts that Mr. Adelson and the legal team have identified as possibly could use some help along with 26 and 4. So that was touched on a little bit here. But going on to competitiveness, District 14 had really no effect to the competitiveness. If you look at the change column there, District 15 became between like 1.5 and 2 points more Republican. So started out at using index 2 at 61.5% Republican, went up to 63.2%. District 20 came about a point more Republican, started out about 58%, went up to about 59% using index 2. District 21 became about a point to a point and a half more Republican. Again, started out about 58%, went up to 59 or 60%. District 22 came about 2 points more Democratic. So that one started out about 64% Republican and dropped to about 62%. District 24 became slightly less Republican, slightly more Democratic. Again, that is probably the result of some of the areas that were removed from that. The mine inspector race increased for that one, and also the Hispanic registration and CVAP numbers went up a little bit too, which is in the right direction there. And then District 28 had the biggest change in competitiveness. It went from using index to 56% Republican, 44% Democrat, down to 52.6% Republican, 47.4% Democrat. So a total change of about 6.8 percentage points or 3.4% each way. The commission has not defined any criteria for being what is and isn't competitive, but this one is closer to a 50-50 split.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Herrera?
And those are my changes, and I did have some difficulty with the changes in the Schultz flood area. And if you'd like, I think there's representatives from Coconino County that can talk in greater detail than I can about those changes, because I was a little confused at first, and then I hopefully was able to give Mr. Desmond the changes that were requested by Coconino County and that the Navajo Nation had agreed to. So if you'd like, we can have somebody from the representative from the Coconino County talk briefly about those changes.
Well, I think Mr. Freeman has to go, so I want to check in with him, and if there's anything you need or would like Mr. Desmond to explore. Okay, for tonight.
Not for tonight. I thank Commissioner Herrera for his work, and I apologize to my fellow commissioners and to the public, but I've got something that requires me to be elsewhere tonight, so I do have to excuse myself. So.
That's fine. Thank you for coming. And Ms. McNulty, do you have any questions on what Mr. Herrera presented?
Not right now, no.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to review these change reports, so I think we'll all need to go over these more carefully and see, but thank you for your suggestions to the mapping consultant and for getting those in. Anything from the mapping consultant on these?
Not on these specifically, but I think what we would like to do is perhaps tomorrow or Friday suggest some changes we think need to happen to improve the voting rights. We want to confer with Mr. Adelson and stuff. And we will have some things just to kind of keep moving forward a little bit, maybe some slight changes we think we might recommend you adopt. And then with those adopted changes, that would be the new kind of working plan then. We don't think they're very big, but we haven't all conferred over them yet, so possibly present those tomorrow. And they're along the lines of improving districts 24, 26, and 4.
Okay, so we'll be talking about those tomorrow at 11. I have a few more public comment sheets to go through. Just 4. Is there anything else, though, before we move on?
Just one other thing. You also have change reports for some changes that the Hispanic Coalition for Good Government, they sent in the files. So what we presented earlier, there was some additional changes and the population was balanced. We'll discuss that tomorrow when Mr. Adelson's here, but you can study the change reports tonight. Remember to bring them tomorrow.
Okay, yes, I see change report for Hispanic Coalition for Good Government. And we'll be talking about those tomorrow when we have Mr. Adelson here. Okay, any other comments? So I don't think there's anything tonight to tell them, our mapping consultant, to do, is that right?
No.
Okay.
That works.
Okay, thank you for getting this work done for us, and we'll all be reviewing these change reports. Just checking the agenda. We're going to do the executive director's report tomorrow when all the commissioners are here and present. And same for agenda item 6, review and discussion of possible future agenda items. I don't think there's anything on number 7. Is that correct, Mr. Canfield, in terms of legal advice? And then that leaves us with public comment, and I've got 4 sheets. So if we could have folks come up. Our next speaker is, and if I could remind you to be sure to spell your last name into the microphone for our court reporter. State Representative Lynn Pancrazzi from District 24, representing constituents from Yuma.
Good evening. I was hoping that I would have some of those legislative changes. Oh, I'm sorry. Lynn Pancrazzi, P-A-N-C-R-A-Z-I. I was hoping some of those legislative changes would be from 13 and 4. So I was sitting up front just keeping my fingers crossed.
Just 1 minute.
Okay, sorry. Okay. My issue is rural versus metropolitan. I tell this story all the time. First meeting I was ever at in Ag and Water at the legislature, a representative from Metropolitan Phoenix raised his hand and said, you know, Yuma has water. We can just take water from Yuma. Well, that's my concern, is that rural representation is completely different than that of Metropolitan Phoenix. The needs and concerns of rural Arizona are entirely different than those of Metropolitan Phoenix. The way that District 13 and 4, way that District 4 is set up is not bad, but Yuma could and would like to stay whole. George Reiner from the Yuma, at the Yuma Forum proposed a map that would keep Yuma whole and would meet all the requirements. It would also include La Paz County. So if you'll look back at those maps from Yuma County's forum and look at George's map, it does keep Yuma whole, and it also includes La Paz County, which La Paz has been represented by Mojave County before in the past, and a portion of it is continually right now, and they don't feel like they're getting the representation they've gotten from the Yuma folks. So they would like to stay with Yuma County if at all possible. Now, I know that there's a chance that that District 24 or Yuma and La Paz County cannot stay whole because of majority-minority and because of the Voting Rights Act. If we put District 13 and District 4 in and kept them rural, meaning that District 13 would include La Paz County, Buckeye, Gila Bend, and Yuma, that way the people who would represent them, whether they come from Buckeye or La Paz or anywhere, would have rural and no rural issues, and would better represent the rural area and the agricultural area down in Yuma. If you did that, you could take part of Santa Cruz and put it in District 4, and then District 4 would be a border community, all the border community, all the way down. So, and you could make one more district, all Maricopa County, by putting Goodyear, Avondale, Glendale, Litchfield, and Surprise all together into one district. And I think you'd come up with a very competitive district, and you would also pull the Yuma and La Paz area out of metropolitan Phoenix, which is my goal for being here. And it's what I've done. I've been to 8 of these. I have to tell you, my minority leader was speaking about me on several occasions when he was talking, but I wanted to be here. I want to make sure that people understand that rural Arizona is different than metropolitan Phoenix, and that rural Arizona needs to be represented by rural legislators. And the way that District 13 is set up, it will not be represented by rural legislature because the majority comes from metropolitan Phoenix. And the needs of rural Arizona may or may not be met, but rural representation is important. We only have 15 rural representatives now. With this map, we go down to 10. So let me tell you, the Rural Caucus really works hard to make sure that the rest of Arizona is represented. And that's what we'd like to see, Yuma and La Paz, and be able to be part of the rest of Arizona and not be connected to metropolitan Phoenix. So with that, I thank you very much, and I hope that the next changes to the map will be in District 4 and District 13, and that you will keep Yuma and La Paz part of rural Arizona. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Chase Williams, representing Self from Ahwatukee.
That's Williams, W-I-L-L-I-A-M-S. I just wanted to say that it was really great to hear the legislature's reports today, but I just want to remind the commissioners that while they do have that constitutional right to present that presentation, that their input should not be valued any more than any of the other public comment, just because they are these representatives, but they also operate in a partisan way, much more so than the rest of the public comment. I do have a few issues. Although Representative Campbell covered the memorial report pretty well, there's a few other things I just wanted to point out. First of all, when he talked about community of interest, he highlighted Congressional District 9, saying there wasn't a community, or the memorial report does. I don't know if they've been to Congressional District 9, but our school districts all exist in that district. We have the same city district, so I just wanted to highlight that. As well as with competitiveness, the memorial report relies on this idea that there is a significant detriment to the other requirements, but they never proved that, as the Supreme Court, ruled. When you look at the governor's actions, there was no evidence to any of the claims they were making. And then finally, with the incumbents, Mr. Sturts talked about this institutional memory and kept asking about this question over and over about the staff that exists. I'd like to remind him that a lot of times in Congress as well as in the legislature, just because someone isn't reelected doesn't mean their staff all of a sudden disappears. You have congressional staffers and you have legislative staffers who work regardless of who is the representative. So this institutional memory or this knowledge doesn't just disappear because someone retires or loses an election. My most important focus has to be these competitive districts that we need, especially in Congressional District 9, and I appreciate the changes that are increasing that. The very reports that you saw today should be a reminder as to why we don't want the legislature in this process, because the reports are so different. They come from two different identities that we have to remember that there are two sides to every story, and the fact that neither side is happy is probably finding some common ground. My specific request would be to protect Congressional District 9 because we do have that community of interest, as well as sharing the school districts and the competitiveness. Remember that Ahwatukee and Tempe have been part of Congressional District 5, the current district, which has switched hands back and forth between parties, so we're used to that competitive nature. And if you look to the report that the Pew Center for the States did in 2008, as well as other reports that have been done based on the 2008 congressional and the 2010 congressional elections, more competitive districts actually increase voter turnout, which increases the democratic process and ensures that more people are having their voice heard. Independent does not mean partisan, and so I appreciate all the work you're doing. And while 100% competitiveness is not possible because of the voting rights districts, we need to get as close as possible to make sure that we do increase involvement in the democratic process as the Pew Center outlines. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Mandel, attorney for Coconino County.
Madam Chairman, members, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I did want to clarify on behalf of Coconino County, it's Mandell. Wanted to clarify on behalf of Coconino County exactly where the Schultz flood area is, and I have a couple of maps, if I can give them to.
Yeah, that's
Madam Chair, before Mr. Mandel continues, I'd like to see if Mr. Desmond can bring up the map that was, I think there's a map that was sent to you that was specific, the areas of the Schultz fire, excuse me, Schultz flood area, because I was having some difficulty with that as well. So if it would make sense for me if we could follow along looking at the map on the screen, if at all, if that would be okay with the rest of the commissioners.
And Madam Chairman, if I could just add as well, yesterday Mr. Gorman from the Navajo Nation spoke about, or presented or no, it wasn't yesterday, I'm sorry, it was on Monday, presented a map that did actually include the exact area of the Schultz flood area. So I don't know if Mr. Desmond has that map, but if he has that map, you can bring that map up and you can see exactly the area that we're talking about, because they did actually incorporate our specific request into their map.
I don't have that one loaded right now. Mr. Gorman did send me that this afternoon. I just haven't had a chance to get it up in yet. I'll have that ready for tomorrow so we can look at that more easily. I don't have a shapefile that has this exact flood area. What I have is kind of a more broad area. I can try to, if I can get this set up tonight, so that we have both everything to talk about in the future.
But as you can see, Madam Chairman, the difference is really about, it's just under 3,000 people is what we're looking at as far as bringing in that little piece of the Fernwood metropolitan planning area. And so hopefully this will provide additional clarification so you can see exactly where the boundaries are. The larger map is basically that. It's a larger map so you can see kind of where the proposed districts currently exist, and then the smaller map is the zoomed in version of exactly the area that Coconino County would like to have added.
Thank you. Other questions, or any questions, I should say?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Herrera?
Mr. Mandel, the changes that you're proposing now, these are changes that the Navajo Nation also recommends or is okay with?
Madam Chairman and Commissioner Herrera, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the Navajo Nation recommends them. They did incorporate our requested changes into the map that they presented on Monday. And so with that, obviously, we support the change that they made as part of their map.
Thank you.
Ms. McNulty?
Could you just tell us very generally the difference between the flood and the fire areas? It's not geographically the different concept. Is the flood like up in the mountain and then the fire up and the flood below it, or?
Madam Chairman, Commissioner McNulty, yes, the fire area is obviously much larger than the flood area. The flood area is smaller and down toward the base of the mountain. The fire area includes some of the areas of the peaks, and we certainly don't want to advocate the exclusion of some of the areas that the tribal nations have said are sacred to them for inclusion outside of the Navajo Nation.
Other questions? Okay.
Would it be possible to get this map electronically?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Richard Weinroth, representing no one, he says, from Phoenix.
I guess I'm representing myself. Weinroth, W-E-I-N-R-O-T-H. I'm a Phoenix resident. I've been a resident of Phoenix since '83, which is, more than half my life at this point. First of all, I'd like to thank the commissioners for the work. I would certainly never take on this job unpaid. I'm just amazed you would do this. The only thing I wanted to say, and I've tried to follow this stuff online and read all the materials, is I do think this competitiveness thing is very important. You know, since I've been in the state, we've seemed to have gone more and more extreme, and you know, everybody can debate the reason, and I hope we ultimately end up with these open primary concept. But I think you should keep in mind that, you know, that for some reason, which I don't fully understand, the legislature does not seem to reflect the overall makeup of this state. I don't think this is an extremist state. I think it's, you know, I consider myself sort of a moderate, almost conservative Democrat. I don't think there's too many like me left. And, you know, a state is slightly Republican, but I don't think it's like Utah or, you know, some other states which are overwhelmingly Republican. And yet the legislature, a lesser extent in Congress, seems to have gotten more away from what the average thing is. I don't know how you fix that, but I think the competitiveness thing is extremely important. So we get an overall legislature that kind of more reflects what goes on. That's my only comment, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leonard Gorman, Executive Director for Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Leonard Gorman, first name Leonard, last name Gorman, Gorman. Just briefly, the Navajo Nation submitted the shape files to your consultant with regards to the presentation that we made Monday. So he's well aware of where the lines are with the Schultz flood area. And it's the iteration that was presented to you just now with the map in the Timberline Fernwood area. So we did follow that boundary. And then the commission is certainly making the effort to further enhance the draft map that was up for 30-day comment. And we appreciate the iteration that's being presented by Herrera. Nonetheless, we would like to have an opportunity to further examine those specific changes that are being made, as Navajo people and Navajo Nation has vast interest in a variety of places and areas. Certainly, Navajo Nation has compromised and been able to work with you as an institute of the state of Arizona to approve the map. We've sacrificed plenty of Navajos that live in the border towns. Like, for example, in the city of Flagstaff, there are 7,000 Native Americans in that area. They mean a lot to the Navajo Nation. Similarly, with the city of Winslow, there's over 2,000 Native Americans that live there. Not oftentimes not of their choosing. So those are grave concerns to the Navajo Nation. But nonetheless, certainly a 63.2 or 3%. It's very welcoming, however, we realize that the -5% is almost bottoming out with our 4.9% deviation that Navajo Nation presented Monday, plus the Herrera presentation this afternoon. So we'll be coming back tomorrow and Friday to further comment on those. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody I missed that still would like to address the commission? Okay. Thank you, public, for coming and providing your input today, and we'll be back tomorrow at 11 a.m. So for tonight, this meeting, the time is 5:24 p.m. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.